you for coming to our special meeting of the Board of County Commissioners. We do have an agenda before us. On the agenda, it has a prayer, reading, or thought of a pledge of allegiance. Since it's on the agenda, we usually ask for participants if they'd like to give a prayer, reading, or thought. What Andrew? Which one? You want to do the prayer? Any volunteers for the pledge to lead us in the pledge? Hi. Okay, come on up.
Dear Heavenly Father, we're thankful for this day. We're thankful for many blessings. Thankful for the life that we have, the freedoms which we have, and also the time that we have to talk about government and what serves the people best. We pray that we'll be able to keep the discussion in a good manner and respectful. Again, we're thankful for everyone's time and their efforts put in to make this county a better county. And we say this in the name of the Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Mm.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. Following our agenda, we have no consent agenda items. On our regular agenda, we have to receive the recommendations concerning the form of government from the Utah County Board to the Utah County Board of Commissioners. Before we get to that agenda item, we do have David Levitt, our county attorney. He's on the phone. We've asked him to speak, and also our clerk auditor's office, and so we'll let David. Are you on there? Can you hear us?
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chair, if he's not available,
The number you have reached is not.
One more. We'll give him one more chance. No, he's trying to catch an airplane, is what I was told.
he's broken.
Usually it's that one.
But you guys are also not seeing
These
this.
are flashing.
Mine was flashing. I just turned it off because it was driving me crazy.
Hello.
Hey, David. Commissioner
All right, thank you.
Okay, can you hear us? David, can you hear us? We'll let Amelia go first.
Are you there?
Oh, there
Are
you are.
there,
Okay.
Commissioner?
Go ahead. Now can you hear us?
I apologize for the state of my voice. I've got a bit of a head cold.
Okay, you're on.
I just wanted to express my gratitude for letting me call in, and also my gratitude for the Good Governance Board for their work. There's a board of volunteers, Utah County residents who I'm certain that their core want best for Utah County. As I understand the process, as I've reviewed the law with the relevant deputies in my office and on my own, it seems fairly clear to me that this process, that the county is not in a position to act on any recommendation from this board until the petition petitioners until such time as the petitioner's petition fails. If it doesn't fail, if they get their signatures, then it'll go on the ballot. If they don't get their signatures, then it will fail. As I understand, that's on the 9th of July. But the law is quite clear that the law provides a method and an avenue for withdrawal of a petition, but to withdraw the petition in this circumstance. And so I think the county is powerless to act until such time as there's a qualifying event as set forth in statute. And I think the most logical qualifying event is this group of petitioners not getting their signatures in. At that point, the county would be free to put forth a plan to change the form of government. My personal belief is that the question ought to be submitted to the voters. But I don't really believe there's any, no one has given me a compelling enough reason for why it needs to be done in 2019 to justify, in my mind, the absolute effort and rush and risk of doing it wrong to go through the summer and rush to get it on the ballot. The ills that the county is trying to cure in a potential form of change of government likely maybe less than the problems that are created by rushing through a process that at best is going to be hastily done, and at worst potentially quite ill thought out because of the time involved, the lack of time involved, I should say. I want to comment as an outsider to Utah County government. While I'm the county attorney, I've only participated in Utah County government for so I consider myself still kind of a Johnny-come-lately. I think that there are two questions here with regard to Utah County government dysfunction. The first is, the question is it the form of government? And the second is it the policies, the procedures, the lack of, the antiquated processes and softwares and so forth that bog us down as a government? And I would suggest that the true problem in Utah County right now is not the relationships between commissioners or other elected officials. I'd suggest that the problem is none of our systems work in a 21st century sort of way, and we have a very inefficient government because of it. Now, is changing the form of government the answer to that? Not necessarily. We could change the form of government and still have the same processes in place and really not make anything better. I'm not a proponent of the change in government. I'm not a proponent of the current commission form. I think that either one of them function simply depending on those who are occupying. But as it stands now, my belief, my understanding is that a majority of the county commission is willing to vote to put it on the ballot in 2019. I represent the county commission as a body, and so that would imply to me a duty as a county attorney to work with the county commission to, in a sense, to facilitate that. On the other hand, I'm also the lawyer for the county clerk. And as I understand in conversations with the county clerk also believes that putting it on the ballot in 2019 is not a smart idea. And so, my duty to the county clerk to represent her, my duty to the county commission to represent it, they're the same. And so I have a bit of a tightrope there. I also have a duty, I believe, to the residents of Utah County to ensure that I do everything in my power to ensure a smooth and efficient operation of government. Part of that is being a check on the county commission. And so I wear multiple hats. I have, I have complex issues that I deal with depending on which hat I wear. As I understand that I have 45 days to review any form of government presented by the county commission in the resolution. I would say that before you sent anything to me to my office, you'd have to flesh out everything necessary to put on the ballot. Districts, who appoints different boards, what you do with the 2 sitting commissioners and their salaries because they were elected for 4 years. All these issues would have to be part of that resolution that goes to me. And as I understand it, there's not a lot of time to get that done and still have time to get it on the ballot. My pledge to the 3 commissioners, regardless of whether they're in favor of putting on the ballot in 2019 or in 2020, my pledge is to follow the law, to be fair, and not to politicize the process. Having said that, I believe that there is a serious danger of having this process co-opted by the interests of a few and rushed to put it on the ballot in 2019. Utah County government will not fall off the rails in the next 2 or 3 years if we studied this and put it on the ballot in 2020. And it's not like any of us are sitting around waiting to do. Really, what the county commission would be asking the clerk's office and many lawyers in the county attorney's office is to set aside everything for the course of the summer and get ready to put something on the ballot. That, in addition to, I don't think that you can, in good faith, divide things up into districts without having public hearings, without going to the residents of Utah County and seeing just exactly what their perspective is on how districts would be aligned. And because of that, I really believe that the long-term betterment of Utah County is to put this on the ballot, but to put it on the ballot in 2020. And if the majority of the Utah County Commission disagrees with that, I respect that. I've got a good working relationship with every one of you. And if you want to put it on the ballot in 2019, we'll follow that process. But I understand by statute that I have 45 days in which to render my legal opinion, and also the law requires that my opinion be done and everything be completed so that it goes on the ballot 60 days prior to the election. Does anybody have any questions of me?
Do you have any questions?
Excuse me, Dave, did you have the opportunity to express these concerns at the last meeting held by the Good Governance Advisory Board prior to their vote and recommendation for the 19 ballot?
And so because of that, I telephoned the chair of the committee and expressed those concerns personally to him. And then I reached out to at least one other member of the committee and expressed those concerns as well. I was not available for the meeting when it occurred, so I did what I thought was the very best next thing, and that is visit with people personally.
Okay.
I guess my question is, we've kind of jumped into, I think, some of if we want to put this on the ballot, and if we want to take the recommendations and act, what are the steps we need to follow? Which, to me, that discussion comes after what is being recommended by this body. So I would recommend that we kind of hold off on the Q&A and even hold off on clerk auditor and have the committee recommend, and we can go back to some of these
Report?
issues if they come up.
That'll be fine. You okay with that? Yeah.
Could I chime in? I don't have the ability to exercise good etiquette because I can't see what's going on there. But it seems to me from reviewing this this recommendation that it's in conflict with itself in the sense that it wants, on one hand, to put it on the ballot in 2019, and on the other hand, it wants to form more groups to study questions like districts and things like that. I don't think that you can accomplish both. And I think that in voting to put it on the ballot, you're voting against the recommendation of the petition. You're voting against the recommendation of the board, and in voting to put it on the ballot in 2020, you're voting against the recommendation of the board. I think that there are internal inconsistencies with that report, probably because it was put together in somewhat hurried fashion with competent, well-meaning people, but when you're playing it, I don't think that you can have those inconsistencies.
Okay, so thank you, Dave. I know you've got a plane that you're trying to catch. We
Yeah,
will.
I'm gonna hang out. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move to the presentations. We'll do the clerk auditors afterwards. If that's fine. Thank you for being here. I can see a lot of the board members here. Cameron and your group, if you'd like to come on up and give us the presentation that you have. I did receive the copy, and it looks like now I do have these. I didn't have these last night, but now I have these.
Right, fresh off the press today. I need to
Are
state
we
my,
having IT issues with this?
I don't know, I have a presentation ready.
It's the
to
same
It looks
thing?
like it's trying to.
So that members of the audience can see.
Oh,
For the
PowerPoint.
public
Okay.
record, my name is Cameron Martin, and the County Commission asked me to chair the Utah County Good Governance Advisory Committee. And I have here to my left Rex Facer, who's the vice chair of this committee. And I would like to acknowledge the fact that we have some members of the committee here in the audience with us. Those who are here, can we advance that slide yet or not? While we're working on that slide, let me just simply say thank you to the commission for asking the critical question, the tough question of yourself is, do we have the right form of government now and for the future? Which really was the driving question for this advisory group, or this advisory council, or advisory board, excuse me, get the right terminology. I sit on a lot of councils, boards, commission, and so I gotta make sure I know where I'm at. You good with it? While they're working on that, if I could continue with just simply as a simple introduction and let you know, commissioners, we welcome your question at any time. Obviously, we are a creature of you. You created us, but at the end, we are more than happy to engage in a variety of robust conversation. So I was started to say we have some members of the advisory board here in the audience. They are Heidi Boldery, Clark Karras, Craig Conover, and Kurt Hunsaker. Did I miss anybody? And then some other roadies who made the journey with us as well. Every time we went, we'll tell you how we went around the county. But I do want to do a particular shout out to Paul Jones, who was very helpful in organizing and supporting us and fielding any question that we had. Josh Daniels as well, who was great to help facilitate and do things. And then a variety of other individuals from the county did engage us, employees and others, throughout as general public. I know in front of everybody you have a printed copy. We printed like 30 copies of the PowerPoint, just in case the technology was not in our favor. And I believe, commissioners, you have a copy of the PowerPoint in front of you as well. So with that, if I could turn your attention to the slide that says purpose. The purpose of the advisory board, as stipulated in the ordinance that created us, that you passed, was to, for the advisory board was to facilitate research, analysis, public outreach, and provide recommendations to the Utah County Board of Commissioners related to a potential modification of Utah County's form of government. I'd like you to know that that truly was what we started at. Do we have the right form? What are the pros and cons of the current form? And if it's not the right form, then what is? And exploring that within the bounds prescribed by state statute. This was not a discussion based upon personality or personnel issues. This was a discussion which Rex and I kept the focus on structural. Do we have the right structure? The right structure that appeals and attracts good people to come to be a part of their civic duty and engaging with the county form of government. That lends them to safe harbor in acting as you'll see here through some of our recommendations, the current form lends itself to some interpretation of whether it is bad acting or good acting, but misinterpreted as such because of open meeting laws and so forth. So I just wanted to underscore that. Now, Rex and I are going to tag team this presentation with your permission, because there are some things that he has some expertise in, and that and we divide and conquer. So with that, if you'll turn to the objective slide, and Rex will take it from there.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you. And there are faint glimmers of hope on the technology side, and we'll see how that all plays out. But again, I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to have worked with such a terrific group of people. And our whole goal, as we thought about this, as we decided what are we going to do, why are we willing to engage in this process, was as outlined in the charge that we received from the commission. And that is to be able to present a set of findings and recommendations that have been approved by a supermajority of the advisory board. And we were quite fortunate as we had the set of motions, the initial set of motions, all passed unanimously. We had one motion at our last meeting that did have one dissenting vote, and some of it goes to some of the issues that were raised by the county attorney. But as we have tried to do this, we tried to, as you know, we had a relatively short time frame that we were trying to act with due diligence. And so we engaged some students from BYU and Utah Valley University. We had 9 students in the graduate public administration program at the Romney Institute of Public Service and Ethics at BYU. And then we had several students at the Office of New Urban Mechanics at Utah Valley. And they both provided some different research that was helpful to us as we looked through these kinds of issues that were raised. And they found a number of things. Among other strategies, they looked at benchmarking other counties across the country as well as within Utah. But as you know, within Utah County is relatively unique. We have, I'm not sure whether we want to call her our big sister or big brother, whatever one wants to call the beast up north. But we're not really quite like them, although it looks like in the next 25 or 30 years, we may even be as big or more substantial in many ways in influencing the state. And then behind Utah County, in terms of population and dynamics, there's nobody else that really compares within the state. Even the fast-growing places like Washington County or the relatively robust places like Cache County. Utah County really is unique, and so we had to turn outside to find communities that were going to give us some ability to reflect more on what we saw. And among that, one of the things that we saw was that for governments of this kind of complexity, it is less common for them to have a commission form of government. Now, some have it, and part of that is because, as you know and understand counties probably better than any of us, counties as creatures of the state don't necessarily have the same kind of home rule options that municipalities often have. and are often much more constrained in the types and forms of government that are available to it. I think that's actually one of the benefits that we have in Utah, is that the legislature has seen fit to offer a variety of options to us. But as we look at those, other states, driven primarily by the work at the students at UVU, we saw that in addition to having more members on a county council or commission, one of the key features that we saw in many of those places was the presence of a professional administrator. And as we heard our public comment, and Cameron will talk a little bit more about that in a moment, that sense of wanting to have increased professionalism was one of the messages that we heard consistently, both from the local government officials that visited with us, but also with many of the other members of the public. And so we're grateful for the work that the students did. The research that they looked at did show that counties in particular, but local governments in general, that have a professional administrator do have some real benefits in terms of being more efficient, more effective. But there are strategies in which to manage that and navigate that. It does not necessarily have to be in one particular form at the exclusion of other forms. It is possible to have a professional administrator and a level of professionalism regardless of form to some extent. But there was this consistent sense, as we saw, that professionalism was one of the marquee elements of the scholarship that has existed, looking at county governments that work well and are able to provide services to their citizens effectively. Cameron is, assuming we get some technology working, Cameron will go ahead and talk about the process that we used overall to engage the public, and then describe the basic alternatives that we had at our charge. Cameron?
Thank you. If you're following along in the handout, I'm now going to speak to the slide that says public input. We have all present who attended a series of public meetings. Every meeting that we held was public. It was noticed and through the public process of the county, and all present who came were given the opportunity to engage and offer their input. There were a series of these meetings that were hosted across the county. We decided to not just in a singular space, but to go to different regions to hopefully engage other persons from those various regions, and to also show support, if you will, to those out in Eagle Mountain, that they're a valued part of our community and county. So through these series of these meetings, we held and we engaged, we also strategically targeted various constituents to inform them of the meetings and to invite them specifically. We invited public officials from your federal, state, and local government levels of government. A number of mayors, some city councilors, some city administrators, state legislators, and even Congressman Curtis also addressed the group as well. We had engaged former county commissioners. Nobody better to judge the form than those who've been in that seat. And it was insightful to hear from their perspective. Knowing, as Rex had, Dr. Facer had noted earlier, we engaged Salt Lake County because that's a county very high profile in our state that has a different form of government, a mayor council form of government. And we engaged personnel at that county's organization to inform us what it was like for them to make the transition. We also engaged and invited all county employees and the general public. There were 9 meetings in total, and they were very insightful and helped us to shape and understand what the issues are. And as we get into the presentation of recommendations, it'll be evident that we weren't fishing for one form over another, but really what is the will of the people, as well as what makes political sense, as well as good sense and good management for the county. Now, we had also, if you recall, when this endeavor started, we talked about having a website. At the time, the county didn't have the bandwidth or the capability of doing that, so you enabled us to engage a third party that established a website for us, which is utahcountyfuture.com. And we publicize that through a variety of means to engage people, and that's how we also noticed our meetings in addition to the public meeting site. We had 41 people who submitted direct feedback related to the question about the form of government. 16 identified themselves as county employees, 25 just general public. Now, we also want to note that this website needs to transition. It was understood that it wouldn't be maintained in perpetuity, but as the county gets its public information operation underway, that we would transition that, and all information contained and the management thereof would then become to the county, which you could easily just shut it down or to maintain it. It's your call. But it was a valuable vehicle for us to engage the public. Now, back to the form of government, and understand that there's a written book. Mayor Kafusi talked about two academicians writing another dissertation. Not so far off the task. This is a fairly substantial book. However, the first 20 pages really is the report, and there's an executive summary, 1 page, and a conclusion at the end that you can easily skip to if you want to get to the Cliff Notes.
Let me ask you a
Commissioner,
question.
please.
On the public meetings, besides those that were targeted, as you put down here, to come to the meetings, what was your sense of participation from the general public who just came? I mean, was there 10, 20, 100?
Well, there weren't hundreds, I can tell you that much. But at each meeting, there were several, and by several, I mean more than 2 or 3, individuals that did not have a formal affiliation either with the county or with one of the specific stakeholder groups that we had invited.
2 or 3 besides the ones that you invited to come?
Yeah.
Well, I would say
I'm
that
just trying to
was
get a
on the-
sense
that was
for-
on the short end. We had a really great turnout
Yeah.
at Nebo School District,
Yeah,
where we
Nebo's-
had more.
Yeah, we probably
There,
had,
I would say,
40 people?
and you had some roadshowies, general public folks who came to each one of these,
Sure.
which were always about 2 or 3, but you always had some others. So I would say, Commissioner, I'm guessing, we can go back, and not all of them wanted to address the group, some did.
Sure.
I would say in total, less than 50, but I would say that that's a good margin of different people through the various meetings that came, that would be part of the general public.
And then on the website, it shows 41 that submitted, and that's,
Formal comments.
Formal comments.
I'm sure there were others that probably
Looked at the site.
looked at it,
Yeah.
and
Didn't submit.
Didn't submit them, but 41.
Correct. We had asked, they had to provide their name and their information. Knowing that we're in a public process, we felt that it was appropriate that if they were going to offer insight, that they would put, now their names were not shared broadly, and you have back in the appendices, all the list of all the various, what appendices is that one? I got it right here. In the report, appendices D, as in David, you have a list of all of these things. Now, we've taken out the name and the email address, but we have that core data if you want to go back to it. But we felt it appropriate for this aspect to then, it wasn't about so much who said it, but what was said. And so we have everything as, we didn't edit this. Their grammar's their grammar, their writing's their writing. So you have all of that information contained in the report.
Sorry to jump in on that.
No, please, you're welcome to. Now, I have also given Ezra a jump drive that has everything contained in the printed copy before you on that jump drive. All of the appendices, as well as the report and the PowerPoint that you have before you. So you have it digitally and also in print form. Going back now, the report is obviously is more detailed, where we go into all the various findings and things. We're going to just get into today's point as highlights into the recommendations. If you have questions, we can go back to any of the findings, because you gave us in the ordinance a list of various things of our charge to do. We did not get to all of them given the timeline that we had, and we identify what we did and what we did not do, and opportunities for the county to engage thereafter after this report. There are basically 4 forms of government that we had to choose from that are currently outlined in state code. The current form, which is a county commission form of 3 members, we had an expanded county commission, which is a 5 or 7 member part-time commission. And then we also had a county executive council, otherwise more commonly known as a mayor council form, and then a county manager form. And through the debates, we understood that there are various issues with the various forms, particularly and very candidly with the commission form. If two of you have a conversation, and it may be about one of your horses, Commissioner, but somebody could see it, or how you your golf score, assuming you get outside and enjoy. I call those course evaluations in academia, where you evaluate the left side and the right side. Thanks for laughing, Rex. None of these, trying to have a little
Smiling.
levity here.
I'm smiling with you.
You're smiling, thank you.
golfed with you, so I
Yes,
know
yeah,
you.
yeah, thank you.
So
thank
you understand, yeah.
So, but the perception is, I wonder what they're talking about. And it could be something completely off topic, but it's easily manipulated or perceived to be manipulated. And we're growing in a size and scope and nature as a county that we ought to have more clear swim lanes to keep people in a safe harbor in their role as a county official. And so in so doing, we discussed the various forms, and the commission form, as detailed more in the report, was not what we as an advisory group to the commission are recommending persist further. And I want to underscore that very point. You charged us to do some research, to assess, and to advise you. That's what we are doing. I know that our county attorney, Mr. Levitt, went right through, hey, this, and that on his recommendation. We're giving you our recommendation. It is up to you to act upon that, how and what you will. There are other issues that should be discussed, and we can get there. But it was very evident from this group that it was a sense of urgency to act and to change the form of government. So in that discussion and process, we eliminated and went down to the form of government that we felt was best. And now we're going into our recommendations, and Rex will talk about the first two recommendations, and I'll pick it up from there.
So in making the recommendations, one of the things that we wanted to do is to have some guiding principles that would kind of help us sort through some of the challenges. I mean, how do you choose between a county manager council form versus a mayor council versus an expanded commission? And so there were a number of things that we looked at. Some of them were, and these were all issues that had come up in the public comment. They weren't just say hobby horses of members of the advisory board. There were issues like accountability that included issues such as the rule of law, checks and balances, separation of powers, transparency. Cameron kind of hinted at some of the challenges that you face with some of the open meeting laws, and the legislature is aware of that. They've tried to make some modifications, but at the end of the day, it's still a challenge that you have to be keenly aware of as you navigate that. We also talked about some values that essentially have to be traded off. Mr. Levitt talked about the inefficiencies of the county. Now, there are times in government where those inefficiencies are actually quite desirable because they've been a trade-off to help us improve, say, equity or access to the process. And as a result, sometimes we go slower. And so, but we wanted to make sure that we were explicitly acknowledging that there are trade-offs between efficiency and effectiveness, equality and equity, and that those things are complicated, but that had to be part of our decision-making. We also heard consistently the need for a sense of representation. There has historically been some concern by some in the community, especially in the, we heard it most vocally from the southern part of the county, that they hadn't felt that they had been kind of historically paid attention to. Now, they don't, one of the things that was really interesting in this process is it was also very clear how much people have appreciated the engagement that this current set of commissioners has provided, and that some of the challenges that they were raising, people were saying it's a fundamental issue, not an issue of who's currently on the commission, for example. Then we talked about, as we mentioned, issues of professionalism. But lastly, one of the things that kept coming up was a future orientation, an ability for the county to meet its needs as it continues to move forward. as I talk to my neighbors about these issues, they continue to be surprised when I tell them that it's estimated that Utah County will be at around 1.6 million people in the next 30 or 40 years. And they immediately go, gosh, well, we'll have to keep all those Californians from moving in. And I immediately say, no, we actually have to keep your children and grandchildren from having babies, because that's where most of our migration is coming from. It is self-produced. People like me have 4 kids, and as parents, we'd like for our kids to stick around. And that is going to continue to grow our community, which will continue to place additional challenges between the cities and the county in providing the set of services that are demanded. And so we wanted to make sure that we were going to make a recommendation that had the ability to respond to those changes that might come forward. And so the first recommendation that the advisory board made was to, as Cameron said, was to support a change in the form of government and a change to a county mayor form, or county executive form, as it's explicitly identified in state code, with 7 members on the county council, 5 of those coming from districted seats and 2 of them coming from at-large seats. One of the challenges that we heard from a number of the participants was that they like this notion of having at-large representation because it forces you to not be as parochial. But at the same time, they worry that if we have only at-large representation, that sometimes you get groups that are left out. And so the compromise that the advisory board settled on was to have a mix of at-large and districted seats, with the majority being districted. And that we wanted to see those have the ability to reach out to the community and have that sense of engagement that people were seeking. The second recommendation that we had comes to the nature of professionalism. One of the things that there were several members on the board who, well, there were even a couple who said almost out-convertist me, but there were a number of people on the board who truly saw some very strong merits in a council manager form of government. But as we talked about it, we decided, in some of that based on the public input, that there were challenges in part just from the public perception around managers. But what we heard consistently from the local government professionals and elected officials was that the presence of a professional manager makes a difference in how well the community runs, regardless of whether it's a strong mayor like you have in Provo. Mayor Kafusi, for example, was able to share with us the value that they have in having a chief administrative officer who kind of helps the mayor in the day-to-day functioning operations. It allows the mayor to keep that larger picture and not have to become so ingrained in the minutia that, as you are well aware, can sometimes be quite distracting from having larger policy conversations. As the advisory board discussed this, there are some challenges that were discussed. How do we make sure that we don't end up with some infighting, that we don't end up with bloat? There was some sense that Salt Lake County, for example, ended up with some bloat between every commissioner, every council member. So you went from having 3 commissioners and 3 staff members to now having 7 commissioners or 9 commissioners, depending on what place you're at, and all of a sudden those staff members balloon. And so part of our concern was we wanted to try and kind of rein that in, because the responsible use of fiscal resources was another consistent theme that we heard. That this is not a desire to have kind of just a broad expansion of government. It's a desire to have a well-managed government that's able to truly meet the needs in the most effective and efficient way, while balancing all of those trade-offs. And so our recommendation is to hire a professionally trained and skilled chief administrative officer, somebody who has experience in local government. One of the things that we heard time and time again was, you may have had this similar kind of experience, where you come in having worked in your professional setting, thinking, oh, I understand how professions work, and all of a sudden you get in and you go, wow, government's different. Now, some of that you may go, well, let's try and change that, and there are places where that's quite appropriate. But then there are other places where we talk about those trade-offs, for example, where you want to have somebody who understands why it is that in public procurement policy, we have, you know, requests for proposals and other things of that nature. And so having that professional that has that training and that expertise that they've developed over time, the advisory board felt would be incredibly helpful. So I'll pass it back to Cameron now.
Recommendation number 3, if you're following along in the PowerPoint, is where I'm at now. This was the most hotly debated recommendation, bar none, because there seemed to, as Rex had noted, a great support from the general community, as well as those engaged strategically, that a change is needed. But the question is timeline. And in all candor, and they're public meetings, right? We stream them. In the one that was May 23rd, where we met out in Eagle Mountain, where we finalized what we thought our recommendations were, the recommendation was discussed to pursue the November 19 ballot. Again, as a recommending board or body to you. It's up to you to make that determination. But as Rex and I were authoring and compiling this together, some timing of issues of concern. In my mind, in all full disclosure, I'm thinking of other advisory boards or what have you, which takes time, given the 5 months we've been at, just to simply ask this question. But the reality is, that's up to you to determine the how. And so I did not, however, feel good about just proceeding without engaging this group one more time, neither Rex nor I. So we asked for the indulgence and appreciated the extension from the commission for us to hold one more meeting where we solely talked about the timing and doubled down. Because in the May meeting, it was less than a 2-minute type of a discussion. And I think it merited a little bit more say in that regard. So we discussed it. And you should know, as noted by Mr. Levitt, he called me, but he was not the only one that called me from the county. I had also members of the advisory board and other individuals expressing current concerns about the timing. So we convened that other meeting. And again, it came down to the fact that the advisory board feels that there is an urgent need to act, and therefore double down on the timeline of this recommendation to November of 19. It is up to you as the authority here to make that determination. There are other variables to listen to from the county clerks, from the attorney's office, whatever. That's your responsibility. But I will say this, no matter what, our strong recommendation is start acting and acting in the immediate. If it's 19, you got a lot of work to do real quick, and it's up to you to discern, again, whether that be on a committee base or advisory board. You just have a small little group of individuals from the county. You can do some crunch numbers on a couple of days, great. But we would underscore that public engagement in this process guards against the perception of self-serving decisions by county officials. So that we would recommend there should be some element of this decision process as you go through it. It can be as short, as quick as you want, but that's a recommendation, undertone to our recommendation. And that's specifically, if you go to now to recommendation number 4. Oh, by the way, and on the timing, if you were to say it's in the 2020, which is your prerogative, you still need to act today to get things done, to make that timeline. So either way, good luck and start moving. So recommendation number 4 is that you establish a nonpartisan committee. Again, is that a committee? Is that an advisory board like you've done with us, or what have you? You decide, but you need to determine the districts for the 5, if you agree that this is a good recommendation, which is in all candor too. It's parallels the petition that's afoot right now from some of the members. Some of the petitioners are here in the audience today. The real difference is the added CAO element, which is not discussed in state code. So therefore, our recommendation on that point was for it to pass a county ordinance to add that element to the administrative function. Commissioner?
I don't want to interrupt a whole lot, but just
please.
On that particular point, part of my question with that administrative officer, where it's a staffing decision, would that be a better decision left to the new legislative body to create that position and hire in conjunction with the new mayor? rather than it be something we put in initially with our action here. We're talking timelines,
Question.
if we're pushing hard for a 19 ballot, is this a particular provision that would make more sense to actually not necessarily reject at this particular point or accept, but to punt on, for lack of a better term, to allow that new council and mayor to actually make that hiring and staffing decision? Was that something that was discussed?
Sure, it was discussed a little bit, in part because we know that we can't, bind the hands of a
Right.
future commission, right? And so, whether the action of the current commission is essentially, we recommend that, a kind of proclamation, as opposed to an affirmation that we will now hire. So the advisory board didn't necessarily think that, this county commission had to hire a professional administrator now, but wanted it to send a signal that we would hope that you would, at least if you accepted the recommendation, that you would endorse, at least loudly, the notion of a professional administrator, and in all likelihood, you would want to have that, hired by the new body.
One of the points, Commissioners, directly to your question is, that's a future discussion and decision, but we did say it should, our strong advice, it be under the advise and consent of the mayor and the council on who to hire. So that would then mean that they are in place before that hire is made, but logic would say it would be good to give an understanding you're voting on this form of government, and there is an anticipation that there might be this other, but you're not voting on that. You're only voting on the change of government. So it's a recommendation that we would hope that you would follow.
Right, now, I appreciate that. Part of the reason I brought it up is I'd had a lot of questions brought to me, what about staffing, what about this? And I know Senator Henderson did a phenomenal job kind of explaining the establishment process of new government and said, look, that's their job. I'm going to vote for my council member and my mayor because I'm going to entrust them to staff this appropriately, keep the costs at appropriate levels, and make the decisions to hire with people that are going to continue to keep Utah County running in an efficient manner and in which it does. So that was part of why I asked that question.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Can I ask you a
Again, just-
question on
please,
that as well,
Commissioner Lee.
since we're on that topic? On a functionality basis, as far as I read down through it, this individual would be accountable to both the mayor and to the council. How does that work in the real world where we have accountability both ways like that? Are we looking at a pretty broad form of stagnation? Because I can imagine an executive decision needs to be made, and yet we got to have consent from the legislative body on that, and it wants to be administered through this individual. Is there, can you just kind of walk down through your thought process on the possibility of some major stagnation in there if you have to get consent from both bodies, or who is that person actually working for, or?
Sure. Currently, it appears that under state code, you would not be able to have that person reporting on a day-to-day basis to both the mayor and the council. But you could have the mayor make not essentially the nomination and the council confirm, so that you didn't simply get a mayor who wanted to act roguely,
Right.
if you will, against kind of the broad concern of the council. But the administrator would essentially report on a day-to-day basis to the mayor, but in terms of hiring and firing, you would need to have that consent of the council. And it appears that when we look at the academic literature, because that's one of the concerns that people have over managers is, well, will we get a manager who we can't get rid of? And some of that, if we look at Utah, it is sometimes confusing because we have a history of having long-serving managers in Utah. If you just take Provo City with Wayne Parker, Wayne's probably been in Provo City now close to 15 years, and he's been with multiple mayors, right? And you go, gosh, can't you get rid of this guy? Well, it turns out that Wayne is a highly competent professional, and people want to keep him, but that has to be the decision that gets reaffirmed. And so Wayne knows that he's likely, if there's a new mayor, there's no guarantee that he will continue to operate, but he has a commitment to the professional ethics that he's going to operate in a professional way. I remember a conversation I had way back when Rocky Anderson was the mayor of Salt Lake, and he had hired a guy named Rocky Fluhart as his manager. And Rocky came in as the chief administrative officer, and there was some sense by Mayor Anderson that this person was going to have some political loyalty to him. And Rocky Fluhart said, I'm a member of a professional association that is committed to serving the public's interest. I will serve you, I will serve the citizens of Salt Lake, but I'm not going to be your campaign advocate. Whatever you want that's going to be in the interest of the government, that's what I'm going to do. And so by having a professional, you have some separation of some of that political tension that could cause some of that stalemate. But at the same time, it appears that it is not unlikely for managers to be pushed out when they aren't following the direction of the council. There's strong data that suggests that that actually
So
does happen.
Another question for you then, on a practical basis with that. If that manager is reporting to the mayor, what specific responsibilities would that manager have on their own, in the way of authority to make decisions without the mayor's consent?
Sure. The way it's laid out under Utah law is that would have to be articulated in either the employment agreement or the ordinance establishing the administrator. And so it's not uncommon to give that person some hiring and firing authority, but again, it's explicit. It may include department chairs, or department heads, but it may not. And so that's one of those pieces that has to be negotiated in some ways, if you will, between the executive and the legislative body in what authority they're willing to allow to be delegated. But it's pretty common to have some delegation over a range of personnel decisions, a range of purchasing decisions, up to some threshold, much like we see in other local governments. And it again depends on the government. I remember working on a project a number of years ago where we were working with, this was back in Georgia, we were working with the State Board of Community Colleges, and they oversaw all the community colleges, there's something like 50 of them. And they wanted to have purchasing authorized by the board anytime a purchase was over $5,000. Now, as professionals, we said, oh, that's way too small, you can't do that. And they said, no, this is our legislative prerogative. We want it to stay there, and so it's going to stay there. We said, okay, but you do know that when you buy any computer system, it's going to it costs more than that. And they said, yeah, that's okay. We want that level of engagement, and that gets to be negotiated as part of that initial ordinance setting.
Commissioner Lee, to your point and in your question, it was very evident from a lot of the feedback amongst the board members as well as the community members. They want a person, a champion for Utah County, a person to go and be seen and go and do. To do that and run an organization would be very, very troublesome and difficult for a person to do. So looking, and there's best practices in ways of various cities in the state, as well as elsewhere broadly, about how to delineate that authority. But the reality is the CAO would only have the authority to act that which the mayor and council would give that person. And so outlined in the employment agreement or in the ordinance, either way, as Rex said, is where you should delineate that function. But that should be a discussion of the future body, because that's going to how it supports that entity and that office. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Any
and
questions?
I understand that. I've just seen over a period of time, personally, where the manager tends to be long-term, and at periods of time in which there's favorable mayor and city council members, power is given more and more to that manager, to the point to where that manager is, like you mentioned, completely untouchable. Even to the point to where just a certain amount of people on the council can thwart the rest of, and there's friction at times between mayors and city and managers.
Sure.
And so I just was wondering if you've, as you've gone down through this, if you'd kind of weighed that out for, possible stagnation on a county level as well.
That if a body is going to give a CAO or a manager that level of authority, they've done that consciously to do that. right? To the point where I've seen individuals run for city council because the city manager's been there too long, and they get in and then all of a sudden realize what it really means to be a manager and that role, and then they back off it and like, oh, that's helpful. That's good information. So there's a lot of people on the outside who may not understand, which leads to the point why we felt most politically feasible was to recommend the mayor form and then add this CAO, because most people get a mayor and council. And the need to pivot to a new form is, we feel, urgent and necessary, and that is more politically feasible, in our opinion, versus trying to educate people on the administrative function of a manager and its value. That said, a council and a mayor, future council and mayor, can easily do that and say, okay, so that we can be better at listening and engaging our constituents and understanding and recommending legislative things, we need somebody who can operationalize those aspects. So they would act under the direction of the council and the mayor. Anything else?
I was gonna say, I might also note that one of the things that we are seeing when we look at local government managers in Utah, the long-serving managers are retiring, and those that are replacing them aren't staying as long. Some of that's because they want to move on to other things. So, for example, my city manager, my former city manager, Dave Euler, down in Spanish Fork, Dave essentially left graduate school, and 30 years later was still the city manager in Spanish Fork. There were a number of stories like what Cameron suggested, but the new manager, Seth Perrins, I will not be surprised if Seth were to leave in 5 or 10 more years, in part because he wants a new professional challenge. And we're more likely to see that today, and that's, I think, as much the changing dynamics of the workforce as we are just the profession, where the earlier set of managers we had, they really valued that stability and staying, and so they were willing. So if the next recommendation is around compensation, so I'll touch on that just briefly. Dave Euler was dramatically undercompensated, but he was willing to do that because he liked the stability of staying in Spanish Fork. And so when we look at comparable managers, and so one of the things that we sometimes saw was when we had these long-serving managers, they were willing to do it, and the city kept them in part because they said, we're getting a real value. And it's those places where they saw managers having incredibly high salaries, where they were much more likely to push them out if they didn't like the manager. And so having accurate compensation ends up, I think, being an important piece of the puzzle, where if you feel that you're putting good money on the table and you're not getting the value, you're much more likely to push back against it than if you go, well, I'm getting a bargain, so if I try again, I'm not going to be able to get near the bargain. I just got really lucky this time. So one of the other recommendations that we have is that you do establish a formal compensation body to advise on setting the compensation level for both the mayor and the commission. And again, some of that is governed by the way state statute works on when pay can be set. But we had this strong sense that we didn't want this to be perceived as Bill Lee setting the salary for the next mayor's position, and I'm going to make up an outrageous number, just to be outrageous, right? Of $300,000 just because Bill Lee wanted to run, to be mayor, right? Nobody wanted that, and so by recommending this kind of outside group, now it would have to be implemented and passed by the commission. But by having this outside group of experts and concerned citizens, you took a little bit of that out of the conversation. It's part of the hope.
So we've moved on. That's recommendation 5, which brings us to the final recommendation, and we'll get into your question and answering. And that is the importance of bringing the public along on this journey. And the fact that we actually held another meeting drummed up a lot of awareness, which that was a good thing in my opinion. But the public needs to be aware. And we have, as a public entity, as the county is, you have very strict guidelines on how you can deploy resources for or against, or just to inform people of their options. And so this is, you can get a committee to do a variety of things on compensation, on boundaries, because there's already set protocols on how to do those things. But this is an element that really needs concerted and focused effort so that it's not misinterpreted or felt like it's just being done just to do it. But there's a purpose and a reason for it. And as part of this, and also, by the way, as we opened up that last meeting, it became evident that if there are costs to doing this, making this transition, and those need to be understood. And I think each of the various entities within the county umbrella have a cost, particularly with the county clerk and auditor's office, on how to make this work on such a tight timeline versus the other. So you need to listen to those points of input. But there is also a sense of urgency broadly that we've picked up on in the community too, so that you could tap into that inertia, if you will, to inform the public of the various options before them. If you engage public people into this process, then they can go and be the trumpet section to bring attention to the cause and to the options before them, which we would recommend, so that make sure that the county is in a safe harbor in this endeavor. But we, as members of the community, applaud you for your willingness to ask the question, to engage us and others. We're very busy people, but we care enough about our community and our county that we gave of ourselves to this cause. And I applaud again the members of our committee and the time and effort they've put in, and those who have come and have shared their thoughts with us. I noted here former Commissioner Ellison in the back, and he and I had a candid conversation, and because I promised him I would say this, I gotta say it, and it's in the report, by the way, Larry, that the current form of government, 3 commissioners, probably the most effective and efficient form, because you can get things done and move things forward. But it's also fraught with misinterpretation and some issues in that regard. And as the complexity of this county grows in its scope and nature, it's time to shift to a mayor-council form of government. We would hope that you or the future body would also have that overlay of a county ordinance with a CAO, just for the purposes outlined in this report and that we've articulated, and that you would move as quickly as possible to make this change occur. But you are the stewards of your resources, and knowing how, and have to juggle and make that recommendation yourselves on what makes the most sense within your authority. So I want to thank you, and I also want to publicly state I thank you for what little input you've given and direction. You gave a lot of direction on the front, and then you said go do, and there was no manipulation here or there or anything of that nature. You guys let the process you let the process play out, and we thank you for that, because what you have then is a report and a recommendation of citizens who will stand by the work that we've done and feel that we've done a good work. So with that, we thank you. Rex, anything else?
I just want to reiterate how grateful I am, not only to the commission, but to the other advisory board members. It's not uncommon with this kind of advisory board to have maybe half the people show up. We had a very engaged board. They were committed. They showed up. They were engaged. They were asking thoughtful questions. They were reading the material that we shared with them. And I think it really does reflect that there was a deep concern across the community, and it wasn't just that you've got this small handful of people trying to kind of move Utah County in kind of a unique and unpreferred way. It really is a broad community perception that we need a change, and we need a change now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Cameron and Rex, for your leadership on that, and for the board. We will take it up to the commission. I mean, this is for us, like you mentioned, we did a handoff at the beginning, and we stepped back to watch the process. And believe me, all along the way, as I was following some of this, there was a lot of times I wanted to make some phone calls and comments. Believe me, but I didn't, because I thought that as we set this up, it was important to go through a pure process, and try to allow for academics and other things to kind of come forward and have a study. So thank you for doing that. We did want to allow the auditor's office to make some comments, and then I think we would like to have some interaction.
Please.
If I may just say something real quick before Josh goes, I think that I also want to express my thanks to those who are here as the members and as the chair and the vice chair. This took a number of meetings, a lot of hours to get to this point. So, and we know that everyone did it. We had some of the busiest people in the community doing this, and so we're really appreciative of it. And I hope that you can stick around. I don't imagine that the clerk auditables take so long. I mean, from my perspective, one reason why this format may be helpful is we have had the opportunity, because your meetings were public, to know most of these recommendations that you're about to make, right? And so while I do have in some of my list of questions, some perhaps about the substance of the recommendations, I think that in my mind, I'm already immediately turning to how do we execute on these recommendations? And I think there might be some questions that are not clearly in this report, but your input as managing that process and at least understanding the sentiment of the committee may be informative. So I think that's one of the reasons why having the clerk speak here, and then we can start. Some of the questions may be about the findings, but I know some of mine are how do we implement them, and we certainly want your input on that as well.
Thank you, Commissioners. Josh Daniels from the Clerk Auditor's Office. Just want to share a couple of insights on implementation from the Clerk Auditor's perspective. First, let me say kind of at the outset that we are really impressed with the volunteer service that this board's done. They were given a very tight timeline and certainly a lot of content and ideas and things to study. And likewise, our office has been focused on making a lot of changes in our election administration in preparation both for this year's municipal election and next year's general election, where we have 3 different cycles of presidential primary on Super Tuesday in Utah, and then also our traditional primary in the summer, and then our general presidential election in the fall. And so we've got a lot of different things that we've been doing. So to be honest, we haven't been able to engage as much as we would have liked with the advisory board in terms of the implementation timeline and the impact from an elections perspective that would impact the clerks, our cycle of work. So basically just wanted to share 3 things. And let me first say also at the outset that we stand ready to serve the county and to serve the commission to implement whatever you decide. So whether we do a ballot proposition in 2019, we stand ready to facilitate that election. And if we're going to elect a new slate of officers for the county in 2020 as part of a new form of government, we stand ready to administer that election. So the preference is really on you as a commission to create an optional plan and on the voters to vote on it. We'll implement it either way. But here are some of the realities and deadlines that we're up against. So I'd say that our input falls into 3 categories. It's preparing for a 2019 ballot proposition election. It's preparing for a 2020 general election in which we elect these potentially new county officials. And then the third thing would be, from an auditor perspective, what's the cost of implementing a change of government more generally for the entire county? Number 3 is probably very premature. We don't know what that would be. Certainly, whatever plan you as commissioners would come up with as an optional plan, you might want to think about what would the cost of that plan be to the county. How would that change the future budgets of the county? Certainly, we stand ready to help with that analysis. We haven't done any of that analysis. This recommendation is not a recommendation that outlines details of an optional plan, right? So we don't know what the future cost to Utah County would be to operate under this future plan, but we stand ready to assist in that process. Let me go to number 1, which is the cost and some of the process impact to us of putting this on the 2019 ballot. 2 main things that we're looking at. The first is the deadline for our office to have the language to go on the ballot for the 2019 election. In state code, that's called ballot title certification under 20A 6106. That deadline is 65 days prior to election day, which would place it as September 1, which is a Sunday. So whether that has to then be due the Friday before, or if it's permissible to come in the Monday after, you're looking at around September 1st for ballot title certification. That's when we've got to have final language so we can begin printing ballots and facilitate sending those ballots overseas to our military and overseas voters, and that's under state election code. So that's a big deadline for us. Certainly that triggers. Would you like me to pause?
When it falls on a Sunday, what does that do?
It's a good question. I don't know for sure, but I've been told from what the attorneys believe is that it goes to the next Monday. Which shortens the 65 days. I mean, certainly our preference is let's finalize the ballot as soon as possible for our own convenience as an office, getting ballots printed and working with our print vendor and our mail vendor with an all mail election where we're sending ballots to everybody. The sooner the better, so that we can make sure ballots are sent out with an appropriate amount of time for voters to be able to cast their ballot. But so that then, if you backwards plan off of that, that's where you, I think, talk to the attorney about the attorney review portion, the 45-day that you probably heard about earlier, which I think when you stack all the timelines, you're really looking at, you need to have an optional plan drafted and ready to go in 30 days from now, and then have a resolution to say, we resolve that this is the optional plan we want to put on the ballot. But that's really more of, I think, you as a commission and working with the attorney's office to do that. The clerk's part of the review, we don't really have a review. It's just we receive the plan, and then we place the proposition, which comes from the resolution that you would adopt as a commission. We place that on the ballot. So there's that piece of the timeline for 2019. The second thing for 2019 is the cost of election administration this year in 2019 to the county for a ballot proposition like this. So there's a couple of factors here. Generally speaking, in a municipal election year, we pass on the cost of election administration to the municipalities who contract with us to run their elections. And our budget, which was built in proposed fashion in 2018, made certain assumptions and estimates about what it would cost to administer an election based on the fact that it would be a traditional municipal election with traditional municipal turnout and participation from cities. So as we look at this ballot proposition, this would change the nature of the 2019 election in terms of turnout models. I think you would have potentially more interest countywide in this election than you would with just municipal races. If turnout is increased, then the number of voters who return their ballots is increased. And if they return those ballots through the mail and we're paying the return postage, that could increase the total cost that we're anticipating paying this year. And then in addition to that, you've got some municipalities who may not end up having a general election, and then you have some small parts of the county that are unincorporated that don't have an election. So what you're looking at is, instead of passing on 100% of our election administration costs to the cities, we would have to do a couple of things. Number one is we would share in the cost of the election because we would be using part of that election for county purposes. So we couldn't pass on to the cities the whole cost of the election when we also have a county question on that ballot. Generally, it's been our practice in the past to share a portion of the cost of election administration, which we were not planning on doing this year. So that would reduce our expected revenues in 2019 for our 2019 budget year. So while our budget from an expenditure side is definitely planning on administering a municipal election, our 2019 budget is not planning on recouping less than the cost of the election, and it's also not planning on more turnout, which could increase the total cost to our office. So just estimating what this could do, we're thinking it would be advisable for the commission, unless there's some special money somewhere, to reopen the 2019 budget for the clerk auditor's office for elections, to plan on about $150,000 to $200,000 that we weren't budgeting at the end of the 2018 year when we predicted, well, not we, but our predecessors predicted our budget needs for 2019. So that's the 2019 ballot. But as long as those timelines can be adhered to, and as long as we can, as an office, be held harmless in terms of election costs, we stand ready and in some sense excited to administer something in 2019 countywide, just as maybe a preparation for 2020. We've got new systems in place. We're excited to see how those will work, but we really are focused on the municipals, and so we'd like to know sooner rather than later what we need to be preparing for as an elections office. The second item is the 2020 election. So if an optional plan were to pass in 2019, then in 2020 we would anticipate having countywide elections for a host of new county officers, the county council members and a county mayor. So a couple of things that go into that. The first is drawing those districts. I can guarantee you that drawing these districts will require, because keep in mind, we are at the end of our 10-year census cycle. Redistricting after the census creates its population figures always happens that first year after the decennial census. In our case, that's 2021. So we're planning in 2021 to go through an entire statewide political district redistricting process. If we draw districts in 2019, we're at the end of that 10-year cycle, which means that our precincts and the growth in our county is the most odd. It's totally out of balance because we're here at the end of our 10-year cycle. We have precincts that are really big and precincts that are small. We've had some precinct rebalancing in the interim, but I can guarantee you we will need to change some precinct boundaries to create the districts for county council members in 2020. What that means, if we have to tinker with a precinct boundary, is that we need to have those boundaries finalized by December 1st of this year. The reason that is that we cannot change precinct boundaries within 90 days of an election, and we have the presidential primary and Super Tuesday in March of 2020. So we need to finalize the formal boundaries that would govern the 2020 election districts for county council members, let's say, by December 1st of 2019. Now, that's something that we can do. We can do that. It's a tight timeline. We have other priorities that we had anticipated focusing on this year, so we would have to direct some of our staff to this redistricting project. We'd have to probably lean more heavily on some of our temporary staff in order to do some of our more routine work. So we would have to expend some additional funds there. Not significant, maybe something on the order of $5,000 worth of temporary staff to kind of subsidize, if you will, our normal operations so that our more skilled staff can focus on sort of working with the state voter database to realign precincts and incorporate these new boundaries. The other element of the district drawing is that, as I understand it, the optional plan that you would adopt as a commission would have to have those districts in that plan. So we need to be thinking about what those districts will look like tomorrow if we have a 30-day timeline to draw those districts. Doesn't mean that the precinct alignments have to be final. We have till December 1st to finalize the precinct realignments. But as you draw potentially future council member districts, that's a process that you can't waste any time on if you need to have that as part of the optional plan. Yes.
Can I pause you there? Just because this is an issue that I think David Levitt and others in the attorney's office have raised, so I hate to take you out of your rhythm there, but I'm curious, do we know for sure, can we speak to the districting requirement? Because as you talk about a September 1st or 2nd deadline, and then a December 1st deadline, you're talking about it more from in your role as precinct realignment and things like that.
That's right.
But it's dependent upon when, from a legislative perspective, we have the districts finalized.
Correct.
And so I guess from a legal or legislative perspective, I'm wondering, is it required to have, and I'm looking to you, Paul Jones, is it required to have these districts finalized before the ballot language is done?
Great. I think Utah code's clear that it is required. 3021B1 requires that the optional plan be complete before a resolution is passed by the legislative body. So you gotta have the plan complete. 504 of the code, it allows the legislative body to amend parts of the optional plan. However, the legislative body is not authorized to alter the size or makeup of the districts, or of the legislative body. They specifically accept adjustments necessary due to the decennial reapportionment. And so between the requirement to have the plan finalized before the resolution is adopted and this language in 504, which prevents a legislative body from making any changes to the size and makeup of the legislative body, it's my opinion that those districts have to be finalized at the time that a resolution is passed.
At the time a resolution's passed?
At the time that the county commissioners were to adopt a resolution to initiate the process to change the form of government, yes. So we're talking the same, end of July, yeah. Well, we're talking about probably July 18th, so I had originally written down July 23rd, and Josh just showed me the ballot title certification deadline, which is 65 days before the election, and the change of government code requires 60 days. So the clerk auditors had 5 additional days necessary than I was accounting for originally, and so I think we're at July 18th.
Which, as I understand it, is kind of two different requirements, right? On one hand, we have the attorney's office saying that there's a legal requirement that this is finalized prior to adopting a resolution. On the other hand, even if that weren't a requirement, we have the clerk auditor's department saying that really these are gonna have to be done on the front end, because if you wait until it's voted on, there's not enough time between November 15th, when the canvassing is done, and December 1st.
No, it's actually a separate legal requirement. So on the one side, you have a legal requirement from the attorney's office saying we need a legal requirement of XYZ.
Yeah.
But then on the clerk's side, election law is dictating that we have that language by 65 days prior to the election. So they're both legal requirements, they're just in different sections of the code.
But they're both putting some pressure to if this is going to be done on a 2019 ballot, to have those districting decisions done on the front end to make that happen. Okay.
Before the resolution. So this is true if the legislative body acts, but if the petitioners get their signature, it's different. Their signatures, that's not the same.
The petition has districts in it.
Right. Although there's fine tuning in there that has to be done. But still, it doesn't quite apply the same as when we talk about a legislative body's requirements.
So part of my question is here in section 17-52A-204, where the requirements are spelled out. It says specifies the number of county council members, which shall be an odd number from 3 to 9, specifies whether the member of the county council are to be elected from districts at large or by a combination of at large and by districts, and specifies county council members' qualifications and terms, whether the terms are to be staggered, contains procedures for filing vacancies in the county council consistent with the provision, and finally states the initial compensation, if any, of county council members and procedures for prescribing and changing compensation. And this is the section that defines the optional plan to be submitted. And so I don't see in there,
You're reading section 404, was that right?
so,
Yeah, I think you're in 404, the contents.
17-52A-404.
404, yeah. No, I agree.
And so I'm a little confused by your finding there, because here in 404, it's not outlining what you just stated.
Right. And, yeah, so you're reading in 404, 4 subpart D, specifies whether members of the county council are to be elected from districts at large or combination of districts.
And nowhere in
Or
those
large.
provisions does it say anything about that particular mapping.
Right.
Having to
Nope,
be
I agree with that.
That it has to be like finalized prior to this.
Right.
It just
And-
says, just simply states that the ballot measure has to talk about the districts, how many, and how many at large. But it doesn't have the specificity of the map listed
agree.
anywhere in those requirements in section 404.
Yeah, and I can see your concern there. Throughout 1752A, let me just give you an example. 52, so in 404, where you are right there,
Yeah.
4G says that you have to have the initial compensation, if any, of the county council members,
Right.
right? And so you might read that and think, okay, at least we don't have to have the compensation of the mayor, because it's not listed anywhere in 404. You can read 404, and you're not going to have any requirement there to provide the compensation, the initial compensation of the executive. And yet, in 203, it's a requirement. And so 203 requires that you do provide the initial compensation of the executive. That's an example of how 404 is not complete. I gave you the statutes that I read earlier.
Well, I mean, help me understand how the statute's not complete, because the statute's kind of a statute and says what it says.
Well,
And
404.
so if we're
okay.
talking about the districting, wouldn't it apply from that particular statute that's applicable here in 404?
Well, and his statutes are going to be different than my statutes as well. I think that's kind of what he's trying to point out, is that he had a 60-day requirement, so he gave you a date of July 23rd, but I have a 65-day requirement, and so we're looking at several different areas of law. That's kind of what we're trying to point out.
Well, I think I think that Commissioner Ivey and I are on the same page here. And I do see your concern. When I said the statutes are complete, I mean 404 does not necessarily contain all the requirements of an optional plan. As you review all of 52A, you find more and more requirements and limitations. The limitation that I'm concerned about is in 504 that says that a county legislative body cannot change the size or makeup of the legislative body except for adjustments necessary due to the reapportionment requirement. And if you can't change it, that means you have to have it established. Otherwise, you have to have a vote of the people.
And help me understand that. Read that for me one more time.
And if I may, I think I would make a similar question there, which is, it would seem that we are talking about the real limitation on that section should be the ability of the legislative body to modify the optional plan, not because what we're talking, this legislative body in this hypothetical is only doing the optional plan. We're not actually modifying the legislative body. Because that's a future body that's going to spring into effect if this is passed.
And that would be my interpretation is what coming from there is the action of the future body. So hypothetical world, in 3 years from now, the council could not alter that, according to that. Is that what that's saying?
We can look into it.
I mean, because there's
Right, but,
because for me, the pretty plain reading here of 404 is that it's not a requirement in detail for this legislative body's, ballot initiative, for lack of a better legal term.
I read 404 and had the same concern. As we look at the requirement that the optional plan be complete is the requirement.
And I guess then we get into the wonderful world of lawyering where we have to
Right.
decide what complete means. Is complete, is the definition of complete satisfied by the resolution stating that there are 7 council members elected in 5 districts with 2 seats at large?
Right.
Or is it defined as complete with a legislative map, including precincts finely drawn into that plan? And I think that's probably the question that would need
And Commissioner
addressed.
Ivy, one point that I might make that I'm gathering from this is an important distinction because it could potentially change the deadline from mid to late July to another date. However, it's still an urgent matter on the districting,
Right.
because even if we get through this hurdle and you take your interpretation, we've got
We've gotta
to be able to
be able
have
to have
the
it by
districting
March.
done prior to the 2020 election.
And that's part of my question. Have you guys done, with the pending petition, have you looked at any of the implications of that having gotten the signatures? Have you taken some steps to say, we're going to prepare it if this petition actually succeeds? And if so, is there some groundwork that's been laid by your office, you know, having known this is feasible, that could help in this process? So while the timeline sounds short, we've actually got some groundwork laid?
Josh, I can address
So-
that. That's why we gave you estimated costs, because we've done the groundwork and we know what it's gonna take, and it's gonna take additional costs.
And in part of that comparison, have we looked at, would it have been the 2015 election where Proposition 1 was on the ballot? Because it was during a municipal election year. I remember it distinctly because I live in an unincorporated county and most of my neighbors didn't even know they had to vote that year because Proposition 1 was on there, and I was, you know, part of the group that said, no, you need to get out and vote on this particular proposition because it is actually on your ballot there. And so have we looked at the timeline of when that was placed and the financial impacts of adding that particular proposition to that ballot?
The timeline on that would have been much more advanced because the legislature was putting that forward that session, and then the commission put it on, and it's a simple question. Timeline's not really an issue. Turnout, I think, is a bigger question, right?
And that would be hard to compare because we're talking about mail-in ballots versus a traditional voting system.
Yeah. The one
And a
thing we
bigger
did look
change
at
to county government.
is we did look at the impact, the financial impact of, at that time, the county did pay for part of the municipal election because of that. So that's where we came up with
That's where
those
we got those
figures.
figures. Okay.
The thing that doesn't take into account is the man hours that it will take for us to establish these districts by December 1st. And in that case, that's where we looked at our best guess of man hours, which is where Josh talked about utilizing our more skilled
Right.
workers to do that and then using temp labor.
Now, I find this discussion interesting because under our charge with the Good Governance Board, under G2G, it says that they were to look at the optimal timing, deadlines, legal considerations for placing recommendations change on the ballot. And that was one of their charges, to ferret all the way through all this. And so I know we're going after the clerk auditor's office to do that, but that was one of their charges before a recommendation comes forward to us. And so we're a little bit behind on legal recommendations when we have a charge for a body to actually review this and get back to us on, you know, those kind of recommendations.
So let me just continue here with the last couple of items. So just to kind of cap off the redistricting discussion, for us, and really for anybody, there is a hard deadline of December 1. Because whatever these districts will be that voters will participate in next year, those precinct boundaries need to be done by December 1.
Right.
And next year, you run into a situation where you have the Super Tuesday presidential primary and then the summer primary and then the general. You don't have any time. There might be like 1 week maybe in March where you could hurry up and do something, but then people wouldn't know what district they were in to actually run for those offices. You're looking at January, practically speaking, you're looking at January as a month when candidates will be filing or making decisions to gather signatures to run for those districts. And because of the 90-day requirement, which is a federal requirement for precinct tinkering before an election, we have to be done by December 1. That might not be a precise date. It's 90 days, so it could be December 3rd. I didn't calculate specifically, but very early December, we've got to finalize precinct boundaries that are impacted by the drawing of these districts. So whether you draw the districts in the optional plan or sometime between your resolution on an optional plan and the election, or I guess even after the election, in November. December 1 is a really hard deadline for having everything finalized with those districts for next year.
And I have to point out, that's not just drawing a map. Just drawing a map is not what we're talking about. We have to have these entered into Vista. So drawing a map is 1/10 of that process.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question on your precinct boundaries that you were mentioning. Now, earlier you mentioned that you had, or not you particularly, potentially, but perhaps your predecessor had very recently restructured a lot of precincts. And so part of my questioning there is what necessitates additional precinct adjustments for this election cycle if it was just recently done? And within that context, how many are we talking about? Are we talking about, 10 precincts that we're thinking need tweaked, or are we thinking there's hundreds within the county that have had significant impact and need tweaked?
So there's a couple of things going on. The first thing is that state law requires that precincts have certain population parameters. I can't quote chapter and verse for you, but that has governed your legislative adoption of different precincts in the recent past, where a precinct gets to be too big under state law, and so it has to be split. So that's one element. That happens all the time. That's an ongoing thing that happens from year to year. Now, that's actually less of an issue here. One of the bigger issues here is that precincts aren't defined just by population. Precincts really exist when you have a uniform set of elections happening in the same geographic area. So if you and your next door neighbor have the exact same state senator, state representative, school board member, city council member, if there's a district for city council, or in this case, a county council member. So what ends up happening is we create precincts based on where voters are in the same district for every elected official. You can't have a precinct where you have two different. So what would happen is, a third issue is that the districts that you draw for these council members have to meet certain population parameters. And if those population balancing parameters require you to draw the lines in ways that currently split other elected official districts, you now have to create precincts so that people can be in that uniform precinct with all those officials. So let's take an example of a state rep right now, where a council district would have to cut that state rep's district in such a way that you might have to create a new precinct or a precinct split that doesn't currently exist, because you're drawing your council member districts according to population. So insofar as that could impact some precincts, whether it's one precinct or 100 precincts, that needs to be finalized by December 1st. That's kind of what we're saying.
But what's the threshold on a precinct that requires that? I mean, is it, if there's one house that falls out of that, you have to completely readdress it, or is there like a percentage of a precinct that would fall within a threshold?
So the precincts, right now, every inch of county property is covered by precincts, whether people live there or not. So how we draw the precinct boundaries is a function of where the political boundaries are for the various districts. So it doesn't matter if there's population or not. So it's, in that sense, population matters when you draw the council member districts, because they have to be balanced, and there's thresholds for that in the law. Precinct boundaries just have to follow the political boundaries. So if you have various districts, then your precinct boundaries follow those boundaries, even if people don't even live in that precinct. So for example, there are precincts that cover parts of Utah Lake, and I'm pretty sure the CARP don't vote, because if they did, they would have voted against their removal, and they didn't. So, but, all joking aside, yeah, we can draw precincts just based on how you draw the political boundaries. So if you draw a council member district and there's a large area within that council member district where nobody lives, that can all be one precinct. We're not going to have to worry about drawing the precinct boundaries in that sense based on population. The population figure that will matter on precincts is when a certain precinct today exceeds a certain population.
My understanding, that's like, what, 2,500?
Yeah, it's in that neighborhood.
Not only that, but the ones we've done this year already, we did mostly because of annexations. Because of an unincorporated area was annexed into a city, Or if you'll remember back when West Mountain was deciding whether or not to incorporate, we had to do temporary redistricting for that because parts of West Mountain were in the boundaries of the potential incorporation and parts weren't. So we did temporary redistricting. So anytime that we deal with the boundaries of a city or a potential city, we have to redistrict.
So in any case, we stand ready to go through this process at, at whatever timeline, you give us, but there are some hard deadlines. And we will have to shift around some of our priorities. It may require more resources, so we stand in hope that you'll be able to provide those. The last two items for the 2020 election are voter education, but not voter education in terms of like sending out information, although that's helpful and useful, and you can choose to do that, and we can do that in different ways, digitally included. But notifying voters that they now reside within a newly created council member district. That's an important part of voter information prior to an election that I think it would be the professional opinion of the clerk auditor that we need to. And if we had the budget for it, and we would ask you for the budget for it, we would send out voter information cards universally to every household, which we don't typically do. We'd send out voter information cards when you change your registration. But we would want to be prepared to send a universal mailing to everybody in the county, letting them know their new districts, which would include these new council member districts. So the cost on that would probably be in the neighborhood of $75,000. That would be a 2020 budget request. And then the other possibility is that the 2020 general election, with your presidential election, with your gubernatorial election, with various judicial retention elections, who knows if there'll be other ballot propositions in 2020, but with 7 new council members, any given voter would have at least 4 districts they would be voting on, right? A county mayor, 2 at-large, and 1 member of the district they reside in. It could push the ballot length such that we would have what's called a 2-card ballot, where you have an additional piece of paper in the envelope. We're not sure if that will happen, but it's a possibility. If we were to push to a 2-card, the extra print cost and processing on that would probably be in the neighborhood of $75,000. So what I'm telling you is I think on the, reasonably on the high end, $150,000 to $200,000 additional cost in 2020 that we would be putting into our budget request for how much it would cost to run the 2020 election. No, this would be just for the 2020, for the 2020 election. 2019, in terms of ballot, this year, we talked about those, which is the 150 to 200, because we're underwriting the cost of the municipal election that we would normally pass on.
But Josh, for clarification, the 2020 cost is going to be incurred whenever we put these hypothetically new, right? If this initiative passed and
Not
we have to
necessarily, because
elect these
if
people,
all of these council
we're gonna have
seats and
increased
changes were on the
costs.
2022 ballot, we wouldn't have a president on the ballot and we wouldn't have all 4 statewide elected officials on the ballot. So not necessarily, but yes, within reason.
But I mean, it's going to be 6s, relatively speaking. The only thing is if it kicks it to this 2-card issue would be the only cost
Right.
difference.
Right.
Because we're still going to want to send out voter information, whether we're doing this in, 2060 or
Right.
2020.
Yep, exactly.
We're going to want to make sure
Yeah.
people
Yeah,
understand.
and
who
these
they
aren't
can
like
vote for.
super significant costs, but this is the universe of potential impacts I want you
I
to be
greatly
aware of.
appreciate you sharing this.
So that covers it. Basically 3 issues. As you think about a plan and you want to understand the cost, we stand ready to facilitate and participate in helping identify those. And then the 2 issues for 2019 ballot and 2020 election, what are some of the things that we're up against? But we stand ready to do whatever. We'll adjust our priorities. I mean, if it was our preference, we might say, gee, if you're going to redraw boundaries, why not package it into the 2021 redistricting? Because you will have to turn around and these districts will change a bit because the 2021 redistricting process will require them to change. It might make some sense to say, could we draw these boundaries in 2021 instead? But, if change of government's a priority and you move forward, we stand ready to facilitate it. These are some of the needs that we've got.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Josh.
So I wanted to just give a quick, summary
Do
of
that
there.
in one office?
Yes. I have 2 offices. I should be able to speak
Oh,
for
there you
both.
go, okay.
That can be fixed too.
This is true. You could write that in.
That's joking.
Does that mean I get the same pay and half the responsibility?
It's hard to say.
To reiterate what Josh said, we'll make whatever work, right? Whatever is decided, we will make work. But we wanted to outline for you the logistics that we are up against, especially considering the monumental task that we already had to fix the epicenter of dysfunction. And to let you know the resources we're going to need in order to do that. Politically, I'm not opposed to this, but I do think that I needed to do my due diligence and let you know from the clerk's standpoint, the difficulties, and then also from the auditor's standpoint. We need to keep in mind just the cost. There's going to be an implementation cost, and that's implementation of putting it on the ballot, and that's implementation of startup, and then as well as just the operating cost to the county. And I allowed my staff to be a resource for this committee, and on the audit side, the cost impact, we were not utilized at all on that. The thing that we were asked by the committee was to help them understand how our county government currently functions. And we did that, but we were not asked from the audit standpoint to give any expertise or recommendations on costs to implement or to have this go forward. Not to say that that would stop it, but just that wasn't done. Also, as Commissioner Lee pointed out, under G, it talks about the optimal timing and deadlines, and even the board in the recommendation admits that they asked the attorney's office, but they never came to the elections office. And in the defense of the attorneys, they were looking at the law for implementation. They weren't looking at the law for elections. And when it wasn't until we started looking into the law for elections that we started noticing a lot of these issues. So it is kind of on the tail end, but as Josh pointed out, we'd had other priorities. And as soon as this came on our radar, we jumped right in. And as soon as we saw concerns and problems, we brought them forward. It just happened to be a little bit late. With that said, a lot of these costs can be rolled into a 2020, putting it on the ballot in 2020, doing the redistricting in 2021 when we're legally required to be doing redistricting anyway. I just wanted to point out that the cost of this becomes almost neutral from an elections standpoint if it's put on the 2020 and 2021 ballot. If it becomes a priority for the commission, I just ask as the clerk that you consider giving me the resources to implement it if you give the recommendation to do it this way. Okay?
Okay.
Oh,
thank
sorry,
you.
one other thing. I don't know if you're going to open it for public comment, but I would like to point out that when you ask the attorneys for an opinion and they give you their professional opinion, and when you ask the clerk for an opinion and we give you our professional opinion, when we have public come forward and say, we think this and we think that, keep in mind that those people don't have the resources that we have, and they haven't looked at this the way we have, and they don't have the same responsibility that we have. So just out of respect for David Levitt and his staff and for me and my staff, I would ask that when other people give opposing opinions, keep in mind that we're the ones with a dog in this fight, and we've looked into this, and neither of us are opposed to this. Our opinions are there because we've looked into it.
Okay. All right, Cameron and Rex, this is our time now to ask some questions, to dialogue with you. As you're well aware, and it's been pointed out, we have not had this opportunity. I think during this whole process, we have probably had one conversation, you and I, Cameron.
Right.
And it was basically on logistics and a few things of making sure that we had something on an agenda.
Correct.
And so other than that, this is our chance to ask you some questions.
Please do.
And hopefully, well, we'll go through the process and see where they're at. So with that, I'm assuming that there probably will be some questions. They're hard questions because we haven't had the chance. So we're going to ask the questions that have been burning in our minds. Commissioners?
One thing that I'll just state at the outset is, again, not just thank you for your work, but I think that you helped us and help the public with a few major issues. Your recommendation on the change of government was unanimous. And you have a large body of work and backup documentation to say that with a pretty loud voice that this needs to happen. And one thing that I appreciate particularly about that recommendation is that it's done, as Dr. Facer said, with an acknowledgement of the trade-offs. So this was done not saying that a mayor council form is cheaper or that a mayor council form is necessarily more efficient, but that weighing all of the pros and cons and weighing all of the trade-offs, you still came to this unanimous decision. So I really appreciate that. And I appreciate that I think it really helped the body when you pulled in to dialogue some of the logistical issues even further. I haven't heard really any questions about this since the time you voted. I mean, that's how powerful the advisory board really has been, is that since you made that vote, I think that everyone who has been following this issue has begun to see that the time is now to change to a council mayor form and that it's really inevitable. And the dialogue since that time has really become, how do we do this and what is the right timing and implementation? So to me, it really did a great job. And I think as that goes to a vote of the public, the fact that all of the advisory board members and the two of you kind of put your name to that decision will hold a lot of weight in the eyes of many people in our community. As we get into some of the details, that you can tell that's where a lot of this dialogue is. And I have, a question on that. And one of the concerns that I had as I watched some of the public debate is there's this tension of, some members of the committee would say, well, we can't solve all of the problems for the commissioners, right? That they've got to make the decision. And there's never been a part of me that wants to shirk, this responsibility. As you can see today, we're trying to understand the details and make the right decision. But that's balanced with this fact that another purpose of the committee was to shield from conflicts, as you suggest in one of the recommendations, that public engagement in this process guards against perceptions of self-serving decisions. And it's interesting, the smaller details actually have more self-interest problems than the big one, right? Because the big one, everyone can say, okay, we're changing the mayor council form. But now when it's, okay, how much are they going to get paid? What are the districts? When do the terms begin and end? That's where you start to see some of the biggest conflicts of this existing legislative body. And so I could sympathize with the members of the committee who are making really good points. Let's punt on some of those details. Why are we trying to figure all this out? At the same time, I was sitting there saying, well, we want to rely on the independence of the body to shield ourselves from some of these personal conflicts.
And I get that.
I'll just pause and let you address that.
No, I get that, and I wish we had the time to do that. It just came down to bandwidth, pure and simple. We had to focus just on the primary question: should the form of government change, and if so, to what? That occupied most of our time and bandwidth with a group of 15 people. And I know I liked that size of group, by the way, and we had critical mass, and they made themselves available, but we also all have jobs to do. So even if that was a group of 5 people or 15 people, it still would have been an issue, in my opinion, of bandwidth and time. In order to get something to you, a vote, if you will, by the end of May, which we took, but it's taken some time to get this formal report to you because of bandwidth issues. So there, it just simply, I don't know what else to say. I wish we could have had the time to do it, because it would have taken more time, we would have engaged more things, but in the report, we identify in each of the litanies of list of things outlined in the ordinance, whether we were able to get to that or not, and make suggestions there to moving forward.
Just one follow-up on that. The chair and the vice chair did have the authority to seek additional time, which you did for this meeting, but really there was no cap on that additional time. So could you maybe speak to so essentially there was a decision to be made of should we make final recommendations that include some caveats on some of the points that, hey, we didn't really have time to get to this, versus should we ask for some significant additional time so that we can get to a more final recommendation? Maybe speak to
No,
that.
that's great. And it comes back to a bandwidth issue for me personally. And in writing the report, the idea is we should, whether it be this group or another group, go on further with vetting these things out, take more time. But we also understood that there was an urgency of time because of the petition, and also persons who were hoping to have it on the 19 ballot. In order to get there, at least needed to bring this recommendation forward at this time in order to make that landing, if at all, if possible, and you have to make that determination. But yes, we could have sought more time, but I'm going to be very blunt and candid. I don't have that much more bandwidth. And I even raised the issues of additional advisory boards on these points. If you saw earlier drafts of the report, I had inserted that as point of a recommendation, to which members of the advisory board pushed back, said, no, that's beyond our scope. We just got to deal with this and be done with it. So there was iterations and push and pull about that. And just in all candor, Commissioner Ainge, I respect what you're saying, and you're right. It would have been great for us to do it. I didn't have, and nor do I have the bandwidth to persist forward. And but Rex, there are other options too, Ken, and Rex could possibly through further, if you wanted to, through his with his graduate students. Let him answer that question.
Yeah, so I think part of the other issue was a commitment to the board to keep it in a constrained, the way we were able to get some of those most busy people in the community engaged was a commitment that we were going to keep it to that.
They saw the original deadline when they signed on to the
That's right.
to serve on the
That's
committee.
right.
That's correct.
And it is as much as especially as an academic, I remember when I had the first conversations with several of you, my thoughts going through my mind is how in the world are we going to get through enough of this? And we did in part because we rallied the students and some other things to marshal some additional resources. Now, it is possible that for some of these additional things that we do have resources available through the universities and other kinds of organizations where we could pursue some of these additional things. And we did, for example, get some data on the county's finances, and we did some preliminary analysis just looking at trends, but we didn't have the time to dig down into what really will be a transition cost, for example. And so there are a number of those kinds of things that I think there is still time to do those. It's just not within the capacity of the group as a whole.
Perhaps I'll ask one more question, then I'll let the other two, because it's the same theme, and this goes to the heart of probably the rest of my comments on this, which is, so this is where I see some of these issues kind of coming together, is the recommendation has been made to do this as soon as possible, actually even more clearly, to be done in 2019. There's also a recommendation that says that is one consistent with the values that you've outlined, that there is a value of having some independence from the legislative body. And so having a committee on compensation, having a committee on legislative districts. Our county attorney spoke and seemed to point out that perhaps there's inconsistency in those things. And as we outline the process today, I still will take that as an open question. Is there inconsistency? So, I mean, that's the first part of this question, and I'll ask that to the chair and the vice chair, and also open it up to our attorney. But is there an inconsistency? And if there is, do you have a sentiment or something that you can offer from the deliberations of the committee of how, if you were us, how do we balance if there really is no possible way to follow all of them, and you have to choose to follow 5 of them over the other 2 that don't fit in? Maybe you speak to that.
Sure. And to understand the inconsistency would be in order to hit the 19 deadline with everything else we recommended.
Yeah. So that, to be clear, if there is an inconsistency, and I'm not sure there is one, but if there is one, I think what people are saying is that it might not be possible to form a committee to determine the districts and still get them done in time for the ballot. We could get the districts done, we could get it done in 19, but maybe not with an independent committee.
So, to that very point is why I asked for the continuance and for this group to meet one more time and delay this report. Because as writing the report, personally, and I'm only going to speak not as the chair, but, well, kind of, I guess, myself, my own perspective. I have some just huge doubts about the timeline. It pencils out. You can, so I don't think there's inconsistencies in the sense that you can simply get a committee in the report, we just simply said a committee. You decide whether it's that advisory board or is that 2 or 3 people, and then throw it by an open public meeting, you can get that done in a week. Because we were also told the data's already there. We already know what the compensation, we already have that information. We can crunch those numbers. It comes down to how you want to structure a committee and engage the public, to what degree. So I don't think there's inconsistencies, but to the point of the doubt of time, personally, I have that doubt. That's why I then raised that with Rex. He shared it. We brought enough to say we don't feel comfortable exercising chair, vice chair prerogative just to say, boom, we're done, and we change the timeline, or we stick to the timeline without further vetting of the committee. And so I laid out before the committee, this is my concern, because I think you can pencil it out, but once you overlay the human variable, it comes very messy, and I don't know if you can hit it. And to that end, the one point that the committee hung its hat on to affirm its previous vote for the November 19 was that the county clerk and auditor said, yes, technically we could do it. We would need more resources. They estimate around $200,000, which would mean that this commission would have to open back up the budget, repurpose some funds to make it happen. Because if the petition was successful, you'd still have to do those things, right? So I don't think there's inconsistencies, but, and personally, and the only way I was able to say, all right, I feel good about this report and this recommendation was and then again, I'm speaking of me, Cam Martin, that it was the notion to send a strong message of the urgency and need to change. You have the authority, therefore, to act and say, great. We too, if you share that urgency, great. But as stewards of our resources and looking at everything else, we're going to scope out this timeline. That's your prerogative. And as we raised that to the commission or to the advisory board, they said that's their prerogative. This commission can do it. But we wanted to make sure that the message was clearly sent. There is need and an opportunity too, with the public sentiment of that this process has built up to ride that momentum into the 19 ballot. So again, it's up to you and how you scope the committee work on compensation or districting. And so that'll be directing on anything on that or any other members of the
Could I just reiterate what I've heard for you and make sure from you that I'm hearing you correctly?
Please.
So what you're saying is you went through this process, you had the unanimous vote, you're preparing the document, and you had personal concerns arise. You brought those back to the committee, which concurred to reconvene. You addressed a lot of the things, these muddy waters we've addressed today, timelines, budgeting issues. This is what reality looks like if we push this thing forward. And the committee came back with only one person changing their mind. The rest were fully committed to moving it forward and voted to fully move it forward in 19 after hearing those concerns.
That is correct, with the sentiment knowing that it was a message to the commission.
And if I could also re-summarize and see if you agree with this, you're also saying that your sense of the committee is, to the extent anyone's arguing that there are inconsistencies, that would be because they're thinking of these independent bodies for compensation or for districting similar to this body. That would be entirely impossible.
Yes.
But that the sentiment would be, if there needs to be a simpler, very short committee to have some independent voice, or even on the districting front, potentially even just county employees to get it done, that would meet the recommendations here and be more in the spirit of your recommendations.
I think that's fair.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I wanted to note that there were 2 members of the committee that weren't able to be physically present,
Okay.
who both expressed concern over the timeline.
Okay.
One was Senator Bramble, and one was Heidi Baldry. She just mentioned to me she was in the Dominican Republic, didn't have Wi-Fi.
Okay.
So there were enough, and there were others also who said, hey, let's have the discussion, so we brought it forward. But to the point, the majority at that moment, by our bylaws, voted to affirm the November 19th.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification on the members present.
All right, I have a number of questions, and first off, thank you. You're a volunteer organization. And thank you for being willing for all of those to, to go through the ringer and to come up with some recommendations. I do have some concerns, and I don't know of any way to try to smooth it or anything. I just usually have to just say it straight out as I work down through them.
Please do.
I go back to number 2, and this is the document of the organization of the advisory board, and we put in there topics of consideration. It said the advisory board shall, and I underline the word shall because the lawyers always tell me how strong the word shall is. Shall research, analyze, and use as a basis for its recommendation the following topics of consideration, and I'm going to go back for a basis, the basis for its recommendation, which to me, we shall use these items for a consideration to come to a recommendation. My concern is as I read down through them, there's numbers of them in which they were never addressed, or they're significantly lacking. And for me, if we shall do the research and analysis as the basis for us to come to a consideration or a recommendation, I find that it's hard to take a recommendation unless we've gone down through the process. And I'll give you a case, an example just happened. I think it was in our last commission meeting. I don't know if it was the last one or the one before. In looking at the information that I had at hand online and what was presented, I had formulated an idea of where I was at on a particular topic. It wasn't until a county employee came in with more additional information that I did not have that changed my mind, because all of a sudden it enlightened me to the point to where I could say, oh wow, I did not know that. And I realized that making decisions and making informed decisions come from a basis, like we say here, of good research and analysis, so that we can have all of the blocks on the table to put it together. And so my concern is that, again, as I look down through this, there are some that I see that were looked at. The biggest block out there, I think you looked at the form of government, how that works, what's the different forms that are advised to us. But when we look at the geographic districting, we look at the budgetary impact and modifications to the form of government, the optimal timing, deadline, legal considerations for placing recommendations on the ballot. All those things have basic fundamental blocks in coming to a conclusion. And so I worry about that. I know that as I presented to professors like yourselves, research papers and so forth, they hit me pretty hard on making sure that I went through the process and that it panned out. So first, that's just one question. And I a couple other questions.
Would you like us to respond to that?
Yeah, please.
Sure.
Please.
I think one of the things that even though we don't detail it, we did have an addressing of each of those issues. For example, the summaries that the students have done that are in the back. Many of those were to try and address some of those specific issues. We consulted additional expertise on districting, for example. And so it's not that we didn't kind of look at those at all. It's just that in looking at them, there were, in some cases, it was simply clear that it was going to take too much work to get the fine point answer, but we could get a general picture. So on the cost of transition, we talked about that with the committee, and the committee said, basically, we don't care what the cost of the transition is. It needs to be done. And so, not that cost is insignificant or unimportant, but they said, we've heard from Salt Lake County on, what, their transition costs were. We think that, A, we think we can do it better, but B, regardless of what it is, we're willing as a body to say that it should be done. And so, even though, some of those, issues aren't detailed, finally, throughout here, I think they were looked at in one form or another. But I think you're right to push on those issues, because those are important questions. And especially when it comes to issues, what's it gonna cost us? In a place like Utah County, understanding what it's gonna cost us and our commitment to fiscal stewardship is critically important. That's one of the ways that the county has continued to function as well as it has.
That's a key variable or a data point for any voter to have. What's the cost? What's that? And we never got there. As we noted that's why the recommendation is to have the committee work be done. Somebody said, you can assess it. Others from within the county said, we can pretty much crunch those numbers pretty quick. Great, crunch them. What are they? But we did not address them. So that's a fair point of criticism. To the point, we did discuss them. It's not, so we addressed each of the issues. We even, one of the committee members, Rob, just went through all, we've talked about every single one of these. But to the point that you need as a nugget, this is gonna cost this and this legal issue and this month, we never got to that granular level. Did not have the time to do that. Our apologies.
So, I mean, with that, since you brought that one up, you don't know what it's gonna cost, for the implementation. There's no dollar figure
No.
attached to that.
Never, correct. We did not get into that.
And I go back to your proposal on here, though, but it does say that, at the very back page, page 20, that there is a capacity to appropriately, let's see me back up. It's talking about the evaluation of the tax structure and spending priorities to ensure that there is a capacity to appropriately fund the new form of government. So and maintain quality service deliverances and so forth. And when I read down through that, does the board, then the advisory board, are they recommending a tax increase? Is that what they're recommending to form, or to have the capacity needed to do this
No.
form of government?
We never talked about or made a specific recommendation. That's all good. If you write a research paper, what are the remaining questions that are out there to go to the next level? That's one. In the spirit of that type of idea, what is missing, what's next, what other components should you as a commission be looking at? These are those recommendations. We did not vote on them.
Yeah, so we don't know. That's the question. We don't know if to support this form of government that you're recommending, if it's gonna increase taxes or not.
Well, that's up to how you structure it, right? You
Yeah.
could, within the existing budget, repurpose things and do things.
Repurpose it, that's
Right,
our.
capacity, you do less of this, do more of that, because you're talking about 7 people part-time and a mayor full-time, a deputy mayor full-time, and a CEO, so 3. So within your existing resources, do I think you could make it work? Possibly. But that's just my estimation. But the tax structure is noted, as was brought forward in the public meetings, hasn't been redressed for decades and needs to be looked at. So it was in that theme, spirit of saying, hey, this is something we heard, this is something you should be aware of and something you should look at.
I'm asking for a point of personal privilege.
Sure.
As a volunteer and as someone who was asked to do this, I find your question offensive.
So, Commissioner Lee, if I can follow up on Cam's comment, one of the things that we have seen in the literature is the scholarly literature does demonstrate that, not with 100% certainty because it depends on the decisions, but does demonstrate that there is a likelihood with increased professionalization that there is lower cost and higher quality delivery of services. That's pretty consistent in the literature.
Okay?
But that was beyond, anything on tax is beyond our scope of what we addressed. I want to
Yeah.
make that clear.
But we just don't know because it wasn't fully analyzed all the way through. Second, did you conduct a scientific survey of the Utah County residences viewing the change of form of government?
No, we had a candid conversation, if you recall, with this group, the commission I did, and the challenge and the pushback was, look, we probably already know where we're at. The real survey work needs to come after the fact when we have something to survey against. And so that would be something I would recommend this commission explore and do. We already, prior to that, we thought we would do that, do a pre and post type of thing. But time and resources, the pushback was, let's go through this process, then address any need to do survey work. Survey work would be an ideal way of helping getting the public aware of the options and the things that are facing whenever that vote takes place, leading up to that vote. So that should be something that the commission should explore doing.
And we have had, candid conversations with survey research firms like Y2K.
Yep.
That have very good skills at doing this kind of work and are very willing. And they were willing, we talked to them about timelines and whatnot. And, but based on the conversations that Cam had had.
You have previously submitted to you, I gave you the prospectus of Y2K services to do the survey work. Just depends upon how large a population you want to go after, registered voters. They could turn it fairly quickly.
One comment I'll make to that is, and I apologize if there was a miscommunication. To me, that speaks to also the ability of the body to extend the deadline. Is my expectation of that was clearly there was a conversation about the front end survey work, but the expectation, if there was going to be survey work, it was to inform the recommendations. To be able to include in the recommendations that this survey work has been done, to suggest that this not only is what the body recommends, but a nice to have as well is that there's been some survey work suggests that it may pass. And I personally always was supportive of the idea of providing the funding for that survey work prior to a final recommendation. I just want to point that out.
Correct. You are absolutely correct, Commissioner Ainge, and I do recall you're very supportive of that. But in order to do that, as noted here by previous questions, we don't have some of the financial information to go and do that. So that would be, so as writing the report, you gotta figure out the cost, you gotta figure out the boundary. Those two elements then inform what you would take into a public survey, right? Because that's part of the issue of measuring the thermometer, the will, and of the people to act one way or the other. So in that light, we never got there.
Okay, so, I've only had this information since last night, and I'm trying to digest it and run down through it.
Please.
And look at, I'm sure there'll be other questions that I'll call you and ask on.
Please.
Could you tell me, though, as you've dived into this and looked at it, the people that are usually involved with it on a day-to-day basis know the strengths and weaknesses of a proposal like this. So can you tell me where the strengths are and also tell me where the weaknesses are in the proposals that you have before us?
The strength is, in my opinion, that you have a strong voice of need and will to change the form of government. That is definitely the strong point. That the groups of individuals we've listened to, we've engaged, that has been the resounding sentiment. So that is the strength, is the answer to that primary question. The weaknesses would be that we did not do the detailed fiscal analysis, the boundary analysis, and didn't do any of the post-survey work. But those components are there, and it is something that you can act on the various form of committee work, how you would like to do in that. And we also have then, onto the survey aspect, have already teed that up with an organization who's been following the process and willing to assist the county further. So in my opinion, that would be a weakness in that regard. I also say that another strength was that this commission didn't meddle into it in the process. You allowed us, you gave us the direction, which we followed to the best of our abilities, and then we're giving you back this report without you meddling. But I know each one of you have had strong opinions about things, and that's great, as you should, as stewards that you currently hold of your office. So that was also another strength, I think, to this process. Rex, I would say also then the diversity of the group that assessed this. You had folks from a myriad of background on the advisory committee and interests. Not all compatible in one way or the other on the political spectrum per se, but what was unifying was the importance of doing something the right way for the right reasons. And this group was also, I think, a very strong group of passionate individuals who are willing to give of their time. That's another strength.
Yeah, I would concur, especially with that last point, that we really had a broad and diverse set of interests. And I think that really demonstrates a lot of the power, that this wasn't an issue that was exclusively a concern for folks in the unincorporated area who had felt that they'd been left out. This wasn't an issue of folks in, growing cities who feel like, the county hasn't been responsive. This was across the board from different perspectives. And one of the nice things, at least from my perspective, is we had folks who are willing to come with an open mind. Some may have come with kind of initial thoughts and reactions, but in many cases, they were willing to say, oh, I didn't know that. That informs the way I'm thinking about this. I hadn't thought about it that way. That informs the way I'm thinking about this, and informs putting together an entire package. And so in that sense, I think that really was kind of the predominant strength that we brought to the table. In terms of weaknesses, as Cameron said, I think there are some areas where it would be nice to have, this is one of those places where I think Commissioner Lee, you're right at the margins. I'd be writing, well, what about X, Y, and Z? I would have liked to have seen more on that. But at the same time,
We would have too, by the way.
But at the same time, I recognize that all of these things we do within a constraint. And given the set of constraints that we had, that was the optimization decision that we made.
And on that constraints, it's not duly noted, Commissioner Ainge, you said we had the prerogative too, but yet we didn't have the bandwidth to do that, and we also had the commitment of this advisory board that it would be a short burn, not drawn out.
On the survey point, or on the politics of this, I'm curious, and again, I don't think it found its way into the report, so maybe it's more of just a sentiment of, I forget the details, and maybe look at the attorney's department. If this doesn't pass, it limits the ability to place it on again for a period of time.
That's right, for about 4 years, I believe.
Of 4 years. So
I'll say anything different. So
what's the sense for, do you feel like the committee kind of made that decision with the eyes wide open and either felt like it will pass, or either is kind of asking us to suspend our judgment on that and just kind of put it on?
That was part of the reason that the committee felt strongly about moving forward quickly.
Yeah.
As I said, right now, this can be a center issue that it is able to get people's attention. If we wait and do it in 2020, even though there's some real advantages, as the clerk's office has talked about, of bringing costs together because of the presidential election, and I am not a scholar of presidential elections, but I'm pretty certain that this will be a relatively contentious election, and that it will be really easy for issues such as the efficient operation of Utah County to get lost in the chaos of a presidential election coming up.
Absolutely.
To your point, though, that's why we reconvened on the 13th, to really, to talk that through, the timing of this.
And not just the logistics, but
Yeah.
you feel like everyone thought through the passing of it and still recommend 2019?
That was an explicit part of the conversation, yeah.
All right. Any other
I've been
questions?
to faculty senate. Those you thought were hard you didn't address my mom at all, or attack her or my validity.
Well,
of
I
this, so
haven't,
thank you.
I haven't asked you my questions
Oh,
yet.
yeah.
Don't get ahead of yourself. First and foremost, to you, each of you, and especially to all the members of the committee, thank you for your work on this. It was neat to be able to step back and watch your process unfold, and to see the hard work and diligence you put into it. We took initiative to create a committee to research good governance in Utah County. And we put our trust in this committee. And part of the reason it was easy for me to put my trust in this committee was because I recognized the integrity and the quality of the people that had been appointed to it. And I knew they would do their job. And as I have looked and read through your email and your reports, and as I've observed and watched some of the meetings from the sideline, I have no questions that you've actually gone through and you've done that. You've done your job. And you've come back with a unanimous recommendation to us on the fact that a change is needed, and an overwhelmingly strong recommendation that now is the time to act. I appreciate your work in academia, and I also recognize the work of academia is to make sure the end of all studies is the need for further studies. and eventually we have to make a decision and a time to govern and act.
you know, some
And-
committee
and I
members
recommend that.
reminded us of that as well.
And, you know, it's joking and truth all at the same time, but I hope you recognize that we realize that, and I recognize, as we've talked about today, as I had the discussion with Paul about some interpretation of code, I hope you recognize that this is something that I've personally done a lot of homework on and researched the code on myself, so that when we got to this point, if there was a recommendation that came back, that we could work through some of these details. I believe a very wise man, Elder Maxwell, he made a comment once, and it was basically paraphrased, that once you make a strategic commitment, the tactical problems are solvable. And I think we have some tactical problems that we have to solve. And that behooves us as the elected representatives of the people of this county to solve those tactical problems if we've made this basic strategic commitment. In regards to the survey question, I kind of am of the opinion that putting this on the ballot is a great survey. And that's why I hope that that's the action that we will take as a legislative body, is to put it before the people so that they can voice their opinion on whether they want to see this change. And obviously it's important that we put accurate, non-swaying information, right? It needs to be accurate, good information, and then it becomes their job to research and understand what it means. You know, and in that regard, a couple things that you mentioned that were important to me that I wanted to highlight. You used the word urgent a lot. I think this county's urgent because we recognize the dynamic shift that's occurring here, and that to act now and to be ahead is always better than to be fighting from behind. You also said something else that was interesting to me. You talked about the attendance at your meetings, and you mentioned the one held at the Nebo School District was the most widely attended, and that you heard a great deal from the members of the south end of this county. And as we look at population disbursement, the south end of the county is the less populated portion, right?
But will grow.
But will grow. And the reason that struck me particularly is because when I took an oath of office, it was to protect the individual liberties of people and to make sure that their government was reflective in a manner that could give everybody a voice. By moving to this form of government, we're doing that. We're giving those people in the south end of the valley that showed up saying, we haven't had a voice for so long, the guaranteed opportunity to have a voice. When we face a great debate in this nation, I know that I have two senators who are in equal power to the two senators from California, because and that's empowering of minorities, of underrepresented areas in terms of population. And I appreciate that you recognize that in this deliberatory process. And I'm appreciative that the people who have felt that took the time to show up and say, our voice matters too. And I think that's indicative of the American process, that we have a governmental system that protects that individual, that protects that minority right, and not necessarily that they get to rule, but that their voice is heard, that they have a seat at the table, and that their rights are protected in the action of all government. And so I greatly appreciate you on your work with that. The only question I'd really have, it's on your last recommendation, kind of. Let me make sure it's the right one. Yeah, the educated and on the voters. How do you see that facilitated? I mean, what's that, from the work you've done there, from this information you garnered, how do you see that? And because for me personally, I'd be very open and honest. I have to step back a little here. I was the first signer on the petition. I campaigned on this issue. And so I want to make sure that any information that's distributed by the county is very fair, objective, and balanced, right? I'm going to voice my opinions as I have the right to, but I want to make sure that any efforts we do from the county standpoint is protected there. So how do you see that playing out, and what are your recommendations on how to make sure that occurs?
So now, speaking beyond what's in the report, opinion here in that regard, because as a group, we talked about the need for that. There are state code, PPAPA PEPA is the acronym for our attorneys. I can get I can get it to you. It, as a public entity, you can take a position on a ballot measure. But as you give that statement, a brief statement, right, you can then also then add the rationale to it. But if you do that, then you also have to allow equal access to opposing perspectives of that ballot measure. So as a county, you could do that, but you couldn't say, all right, all county employees go out and canvass neighborhoods. That's deploying county resources for a particular position. You can't do that. But if you can simply say, we as a county commission, and you can endorse basically this petition option with, and again, I would say, follow very carefully the advice of counsel, because I just saw some people moving here to my periphery. Follow counsel, but you have to, at least as my experience has been, as you issue that statement, you can provide a rationale, but you have to provide equal access to alternate points of view and engage in that, and then let it go. But you could also then have, hold public meetings to open and debate and discuss it. The survey is another great way, because then you're tapping into registered voters, a likely population that would engage on the matter. And then I would then enlist private citizens who care. Like, I would come forth, great, on my social media, say, hey, this is important. And it's up to me to make that choice, but you could engage private citizens to act of their own accord in that matter. Rex, did you have any other thought? But those are, in my experience has been, and again, holding public meetings to discuss this one issue and what it is brings attention to it, because you have to notice it. So you're using the law as it's intended to inform people of options and then have a robust conversation. But we were at the chamber event, Commissioner Ivey, you and I, and everybody said, hey, it would have been nice to have somebody with an alternate point of view. Everybody here believes that change is necessary. Well, it's because that's really the sentiment of the will of the people that we've engaged. But nonetheless, there's still an opportunity to discuss it.
Right.
And there are organizations like the chamber and the various chambers throughout Utah County that I think would love to have an engagement and discuss about these things. That's not the resources being deployed of the county, but like organizations who have invested interest in the nature thereof.
I would say the only thing I would add to that is explicitly is that you have a group of volunteers who have spent the last couple of months trying to think carefully about this, and they believe in the process and the recommendations that they've made. And I think that each of them it would be excited to be engaged in one way or another of telling this story. That we did some work, people listened, and we think it's a good idea.
Right. The next question I'd have comes back to the notion of cost. And obviously, from my perspective, it becomes us, as we put our actual proposal together, that we would step into the clerk auditor's office and crunch those numbers and come out with a hardline number. My understanding, and this is where I'm asking the question because you give me the opportunity to correct me if I'm wrong, the overwhelming feel and opinion of the committee itself was outside of some base salaries for mayor and council. A lot of the staffing and other associated costs that would potentially impact future budgets would be made by the new governing body.
That's my understanding
Yes.
of the sentiment of the community.
And because I just, and that was my understanding, I just wanted to clarify that, because to me that makes a lot of sense, that we have a responsibility as the legislative body in acting to clearly say this is what it costs to institute this, and then the newly elected officials have to come up with the budgetary means for allocation of taxpayer funds on staffing levels and what that looks like.
Every time we went down that path, folks were pretty quick to say, hey, we can't make that decision for the future body. We got to get back up. And so anytime there was a draw to that type of questioning, it was a pull back, stay on scope of whether to change or not, and make the change based upon what we think is the right form, and then figure out the tactics, right?
Right.
Get the strategy down, then decide the tactics.
Okay, thank you. And again, thank you for all your effort, and to the committee members here today and those that participated, a great thank you to your time and efforts.
Thank you.
Anything else, Commissioner? Oh, thank you for all your work.
Thank you for being here. we'll keep asking the questions. There's offensive questions that asked on all kinds of different sides. That's gonna happen, as we work down through it. And so, thank you for this report.
Commissioners, I think you have both of our contact information as well, and it's in the report, as well as other members of the committee. Feel free to engage them.
Right.
They're all concerned, vested citizens, and we thank you for your trust and for the opportunity to be of service.
Thank you. Now we'll go back to our agenda. We have no work session items. We do have public comment. Are there any that would like to have public comment? If you just raise your hand so I can get an idea. I've got 4, it looks like. 2, 3, 4. Did I see 4?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3.
Commissioner Larson?
I only see 3. 4. Okay, 4. Okay, if you can kind of keep your comments to, this is not a debate, this is not a question and answer, this is public comment. If you'll kind of keep your question, or your public comments to that. Come on up.
I'm Tom Sackvich from Spanish Fork. I'm a member of the Board of Adjustment, member of your legislative body, quasi-judicial. A comment would be is that, yes, there was a sense of urgency to get this done. There was a sense of complexities, but I found that the urgencies isn't clear to me. The idea of representation is already here with 3 at large. Every one of you should be as familiar with Eagle Mountain as you are with Santaquin, and Soldier Summit to Alpine. So you ought to know these people and their cities. The complexities is addressed, I believe, through the cities and towns. As those areas grow and as more and more areas get incorporated, those cities and towns will be the direct representation of those people and will address infrastructure needs, representation needs. Kurt Bramble corrected me when I said that I thought there was 10,000 in the unincorporated areas of the county, and he says actually it's 8,750 from the last count a few years ago. But I left at the end of the meeting in Eagle Mountain on May 23rd. I just pinged a few people that I grabbed, and one thought that once you issue a budget, you can then pull it back from that department. And Kurt Bramble supported me on this when I told the individual, no, they cannot do that. Once it's issued, they have it. But one of the members of the advisory board thought you could do that. Another member of the advisory board thought you had large staffs, either individually or as a group. They weren't sure. And I said, no, as far as I know, from the last few months ago, you only have one person that supports you in your duties. So they were surprised by that. The need for the separation of the executive legislative powers, of course, that's already done through the Board of Adjustment boards, planning boards, the other boards that you have. So those are the legislative quasi-judicial bodies that you have. So with that, what is the purpose and function of the county? I didn't hear that at the one meeting I was able to go to. I thought that was the end of it in May, and so I missed the one for June 13th. I didn't bother looking at the website. But as far as I know, we didn't address what the functions and purpose of the county has been, and not everyone understood that. And the chief admin officer, if it's a chief administrative officer, does that mean, and does that pretend that we end certain bodies or certain positions from being elected officers? Would they become more administrative positions, and we do away with the elected bodies? So those are a couple of things. There are others I don't want to take up the time. I'll send it to you later, but those are the things that came to my mind immediately. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. Jenny Reese, Mayor of Cedar Hills. I did want to take a minute, first of all, to thank the committee. I did attend 3 of their meetings in person, and I watched several of them online, and could tell that they put in a lot of time and effort and research in really exploring all the options and doing what this commission has asked them to do. And so thank you all for all of your efforts in that. With respect to the recorder's office, I do want to say that as a resident of the county and as a city leader, we all have a dog in this fight. This isn't just for the county's clerk's office or the attorney's office to have a dog in this fight. It matters to all of us. We're all struggling with some of the dysfunction that's occurred in this county. And I would hope that the feedback that you get from the public will be just as valuable and important to you as the feedback that you get from county employees. As a city leader, I look at state code all the time. It's not hard to understand, so all of us have the opportunity to read through it and understand it. I don't think that we have to defer only to the county attorney's office on understanding state code. I was surprised to hear some of the concerns that the clerk's office and the attorney's office raised in the June 13th meeting and in this meeting, because to my knowledge, they weren't brought forth to the committee prior to those two events. And I feel like the committee chair did a great job of noticing these meetings and letting the public know that there was always an opportunity to come, share your thoughts and your feedback, and it appears that maybe there was some miscommunication between the commissioners and county other elected officials on their ability to bring forth their analysis and their concerns, but I think that the committee did a great job with all of the information that they had available to them and through their own research. In the end, I think that this change is needed, and I think it's supported by a vast majority of people in the county. I think that they saw that through the hearings that they had. I have heard it as I've been out providing my feedback and opinion to residents in my city and throughout the county. This is something that needs to happen. This is something that residents support, and there is a sense of urgency to get this done. I think that your committee that you have put together has made their recommendation. They actually did it twice, but they've made their recommendation, and now it's time to go forward and push through that recommendation. Commissioner Ivey, I do want to express my appreciation to you. I know I was a delegate when you were running for this office, and you made a promise back then that you would look into changing the county form of government, and you've done a great job with researching the options and researching state code and what we can and can't do, and made a recommendation and have been supportive of this change, and I appreciate your efforts there. And Commissioner Ainge, I'm reading from your website where you state, because of these conflicts, I have not publicly weighed in on any of my specific preferences, but have instead promised to support whatever is recommended by the committee in their final report. I didn't see a caveat there that you would only support it if you approved of how they came to their conclusion. So I hope that you will stand by that. The recommendation is to put that on the ballot in November of 2019, to have us vote on our leaders in November of 2020, so that this comes into effect in January 2021. I hope that Commissioner Ivey and to Commissioner Ainge that you will stick with what you've told us as residents. We're trusting you that you'll go forward and do what you said. Thank you.
I just want to make one comment. One, I do think that Mayor Reese has done an incredible job. Whenever I've been at these meetings, she does a great job. And I think that we do need to listen to the public on the interpretation of state law. And I have been persuaded at times by people who have a professional approach, and they debate the issues with facts and understanding of the law. And I think Mayor Reese has been a great example of that. There is, of the entire time of observing, mostly through live streaming, the meetings, there was only one time where I felt like I needed to defend any county employees, and I'll do that now here, and that is anyone who wants to be critical. In my view, we can have different opinions. In my view, the county attorney and the clerk auditor were always available to and ready to assist. And any time they were asked a question, they were ready and they were responsive. And so when anyone was to suggest that, oh, how come this is coming up now? Really, they're coming up now by their own proactive actions, because still to this day, a lot of those questions had never been asked of them from the committee. And so I am very grateful for the work of our county attorney's office. I think that we have some of the very best. I think that our clerk auditor is, and her deputies and her entire staff are taking an entire new approach that's changing the way we do things in Utah County in a positive way, and they were ready and responsive the entire time. So that's just one comment. But I do agree that the public's insight is valuable, and I think that members of the petition group have provided a lot of insight. And even to our staff's credit, I think they always listen with an open mind whenever, whether it's Brian Chapman or Mayor Reese or Commissioner Ivey or anyone who is stated as a petitioner helps interpret the code, they'll go and take a careful look at that and say, you know what, I think you're right. So I appreciate both perspectives into this.
Commissioners, my name is Cliff Strachan. I work for the Provo City Council as their executive director, and they're keenly interested in the process that's been followed and the recommendation that you'll be making. As we listen to some of the presentations by staff, I think it's important to recognize that the attitude, and I've heard this in the attitude with also some concerns about the resources that are necessary, and those ought to be paid attention to. The in my career in local government, I think what I've noticed is it's very easy to get caught up in the why can't we's rather than the how can we's. And I think you're faced with this I think Commissioner Ivey couched it as strategy and tactics. And so you've got a strategic question to answer, and I believe the Provo City Council and the members I've talked to, and they're considering a resolution on July 9th in support of a recommendation and putting the question to the voters in November of this year. And the issue, I think, is take the strategic question, then figure out how to give the resources to the staffers so they can get this job done. I do believe when you talk about the ballot question going forward, when you're dealing with a ballot question for a bond, for example, you're not expected to design the entire building. You need to have the concept. You need to have a sense of what it's going to cost you and what the bond costs are going to be, et cetera, et cetera. You put that before the voters. You don't go spend $3-4 million on the design of a new building for a new school or a new city center until you've got the voters' approval to go ahead and move forward. So some of the questions you have that have been raised is this concurrency, whether or not you have the right to put the ballot question to the voters and ask them to give you direction, and also this issue of redistricting. Now, I'm glad that they understand where the timing is on the redistricting because of the, I think you said the presidential primary in March of next year. So that does bring your timing forward. But I think the way you can address it, given the staffing needs, is you could create another committee like you've got now, and have them do an independent redistricting recommendation back to the commission in time for that process. And some of the other questions you may have, what are your staffing needs? I guarantee you there's a lot of cities around the county who have that experience that can help advise you and provide some recommendations on what your staffing needs to be and what those costs are as you go forward. So I do think it's important that you do move forward. I think the concern that I think our council would have is this issue of whether or not to drag out the eventual implementation 3 more years. No matter when you do it, it's going to be it's going to be a significant effort. But I believe that what you're hearing in the communities and within the county is a desire to move forward and move forward soon. With that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Okay, I think we've got one more public comment. Come on up. No, I think you're it.
I've got a number of friends here today. I hope they're friends when I finish. I've always been fairly objective and open, I think, in my thinking. And I try to be unpolitical in making my comments, and that's where I'm coming from today. Because I think we need to be objective as we address this particular issue. It's always been amazing to me that we get people running for office who have all the answers before they come in and sit in the seat for a while. We need to make sure we understand what we're doing before we make a decision. I'm not attacking anyone, I'm merely giving my opinion of things. The process that has gone through to this point in time, in my opinion, and I'm not attacking academia because that's important to us, but I think it's been a somewhat academic process. We won't know the right answer until we get the experience down the road. That speaks to the fact that we need to make sure we do it right. We need to make sure that people are informed. And to that end, I will tell you that quite often, and this is not a popular thing for me to say, that quite often the public is the least well-informed people. You have the answers. You know what is going on in county government. I had the opportunity of serving there for 12 years and 8 years prior to that as mayor, and longer than 20 years in a number of other capacities that worked with government. I still don't know all the answers, but what I'm suggesting to you is that a relatively small group of people who say we need to change, in my opinion, isn't really representative of what needs to be. And so I think before you put the question on the ballot, you need to make sure that you can do it in such a way that it informs the voter so they can make the proper choice. It's incumbent upon you to make sure that that happens, and I would hope that you will do that. Right now, and I don't know that this has been lost in this process, but there aren't only 3 elected officials that run Utah County. There are 10, as I count. And you 3 and then the other 7 are independently elected. They run their departments. I don't think the public understands that. To that end, my question is when you hire an administrator or a manager, what is it that they're managing? You need to make sure you understand that. Because there's certain things that they can have input into, but other things are already being managed. These are only things that ought to be considered. I'm not attacking, I don't intend to be attacking anyone, but just sharing insights with you. To the issue, and I think this is my last point, to the issue of districting or not, has the decision been made by you gentlemen to put the ballot, the language on the ballot to district?
We just received the recommendation, is all we're doing, yeah.
Okay, so one of the issues could be to do this without districting at large. My feeling is that when you district, you get, in this case, 5 people who answer to smaller groups. And to me, and it was stated by someone else here today, I've always viewed that a county commissioner's role was to represent all people in the county, and that I answered to all people in the county, not just to the people from which I'm elected in a given district. I'm elected at large. I always felt like that was the better way to go. I still feel that way. That would eliminate part of your problem in terms of getting things ready for a ballot. Thank you for your time.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you for being with us. A motion to adjourn would be in order.
So moved.
Second?
And a motion and a second to adjourn. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye, that passes 3-0. Thank you. Thank you for being here.